Story 1. The night pharaohs invented the first alarm. The night air over Thebes hung warm and dry, rippling softly with the scent of sand, oil, and distant river reeds. In the deep shadows of the temple walls, silence reigned. Not the silence of sleep, but a purposeful stillness watched, timed and kept by those who never truly rested. Inside the sacred chambers of Amun-Ra, beneath towering columns inscribed with prayers to the sun god, a solitary priest moved slowly along the stone corridor. He was the timekeeper, not a title given formally, but a role understood by all within the temple. Clutched in his hand was a small clay vessel containing a measured amount of sesame oil, and in that oil, a thin wick slowly burned. This, for now, was his clock. Before mechanical time, before sandglasses and bells and pendulums, there was firelight. Fire was both illumination and measurement. The ancient Egyptians were among the first to divide the night not just into vague phases of dark, but into specific hours, and the invention of the night alarm, if one can call it that, begins here. This is not a story of war or pharaohs in conquest. It is a story of watchmen, of oil, of ritual, and of the slow, deliberate crafting of temporal order and order that made early civilization possible. Hours born in darkness. To understand the quiet genius of Egypt's nocturnal timekeeping, one must step back into the rhythms of the 18th dynasty, circa 1500 BCE. Time in Egypt was not abstract. It was cosmological. Day and night were ruled by the gods, and each hour had its own deity, its own protective power. But how does one honor an hour if one does not know when it begins? Enter the water clock, or clepsydra, one of the earliest known devices for measuring time independent of the sun. A simple yet powerful invention, it worked by the slow dripping of water through a small hole in a bowl. Each drop told a story, a reliable whisper of seconds accumulating into hours. But at night, when temple rituals had to be performed at precise intervals, something more visual was required. Thus came the oil clock, a lamp that could be calibrated. Priests learned to determine how long it would take a specific volume of oil to burn down. They could mark the vessel and use the descending level of oil to track time, like a flickering timeline drawn in flame. What emerged was a system, 7 to 12 hours of night, each assigned to a guardian priest and a sacred task. These priests would rise not by the call of a rooster, but by the position of a shadow or the absence of oil. And from this, the concept of a night alarm, not mechanical, but visual and ritualistic, was born. The ritual of the watch. Every temple had its own rules, but the great sanctuaries of Karnak and Luxor followed a meticulous schedule. The hours of the night were each marked by a different duty: incantations, libations, fumigations, or the turning of the sacred statue. These were not optional. To miss an hour was to displease the gods, a potentially disastrous offense. Thus, teams of priests worked in shifts, rotating through the dark, taking turns to monitor the sacred flame or water flow. When one flame expired, it was a signal. Not unlike a snooze button, a fresh lamp was lit by the next priest, who would note the level and begin his own count. What makes this history so profoundly boring and yet quietly revolutionary is how ordinary it was. Night after night, the same oil, the same dripping water, the same turning of time. But this tedium built a system. The priests were not merely caretakers of ritual. They were early chronologists, their routine a precursor to regulated time. The idea of keeping time at night, of measuring the unseeable, was an act of devotion but also practicality. By regulating night, they regulated the work of the gods and of men. This unseen labor, uncelebrated, undocumented in drama, was the backbone of order in the Nile Valley. Time's other senses. These early timekeepers did not rely solely on oil and water. Sound, too, played a role. The rustling of palm fronds, the calls of desert birds, the distant creaking of wood barges as they moored at the Nile's edge. Egyptian priests were trained to hear the night as much as watch it. Certain insects chirped only during specific hours. The call of the night heron, the rising of mist from the Nile, these were clocks to the attuned. In some temples, small gongs or bells were used to signal the changing of the hour to those stationed in different chambers. Though no physical alarms like those we know today existed, the purpose was the same: to wake, to alert, to prepare. These rudimentary cues, burnt oil, dripping water, nocturnal sounds, created a network of reminders, a proto-alarm system that operated not on devices, but on observation and discipline. It required memory, attention, and trust. The timekeeper was often chosen from among the most senior or reliable members of the priesthood. He was not merely a man with a lamp. He was the conduit through which divine time passed into human ritual. The mathematical flame. Modern researchers have reconstructed these ancient timepieces and tested their precision. An oil lamp, carefully prepared, could measure time to within 15-20 minutes per hour, remarkably accurate for 3,500 years ago. Some clay lamps discovered from this era have etched lines along the interior, likely marks denoting time intervals as the oil level dropped. Others have small holes on the side, possibly for adjusting airflow to fine-tune the burn rate. This suggests not only an awareness of time, but an attempt to engineer it. Even more fascinating is the design of temple routines themselves. They were optimized for energy conservation, rotating tasks so that no single priest was too fatigued. This was, in essence, a kind of human scheduling algorithm, one based not on efficiency but on cosmic harmony. It is here that the true weight of Egypt's night alarms becomes clear. They represent one of humanity's first attempts to manage labor, rest, and ritual according to artificially regulated time. When the sun doesn't help. The importance of nighttime timekeeping is more pronounced when you consider the Egyptian calendar. Based on the heliacal rising of Sirius and the movements of constellations like Orion, time was embedded in the stars. But stars move slowly. They don't offer minute-by-minute structure. So how did a temple in darkness, miles from the open sky, know what time it was? That's where oil and water returned as saviors. The temple complex was a world unto itself, often windowless, built to control light and heat. Inside, sunlight could not be trusted. Priests had to create time artificially. In many ways, Egyptian temples were the earliest laboratories of time standardization, spaces that ran on controlled light, controlled silence, and controlled schedules. Outside the temple, most of Egypt lived by the sun's rise and fall. Farmers worked in rhythm with dawn. Markets opened at midday. But inside, a clock ticked in quiet increments of flame. It was an entirely different world, one that did not sleep with the rest. A precursor to industrial sleep. Today, we are surrounded by digital alarms, push notifications, timers, and calendars. Yet the concept of regulated wakefulness, of structured interruptions to sleep, is much older. The priests of ancient Egypt had no clocks, no bells, no screens. But they had tasks, divisions of the night, and reliable systems for ensuring they were roused at the proper time. Their method was spiritual, sensory, and systemic. In many ways, this practice foreshadowed factory schedules, military watch rotations, and even shift work. The very idea that some must wake while others rest is an old one, and the alarm, whether sounded by burning oil or beeping phone, is the tool that makes it possible. Not all was divine. Despite its sacred veneer, temple life was still human. Priests dozed, rituals were delayed, oil ran out. There are sparse references in ostraca, scraps of pottery used for writing about missed hours or arguments over shifts. Human error persisted, even in the house of the gods. There is something comforting in that. Even at the dawn of timekeeping, people overslept. Yet the commitment to maintaining these nightly rituals, century after century, speaks to the depth of Egypt's devotion to structure. Their alarms were not just for priests, but for eternity itself, keeping the sun rising, the gods appeased, and the world in balance. A question in the flame. One imagines the last drop of oil flickering in a quiet temple chamber. The shadows lengthen. The flame bends, then vanishes. A moment of darkness. Then the next priest enters, eyes adjusted, ready to light the next lamp. Another hour begins. Was this, perhaps, the world's first snooze button? And in a world that so carefully measured time without machines, who kept the timekeepers awake? The second priest of the night would arrive silently. His sandals would barely whisper against the cold limestone floor, and the only sound greeting him would be the near-empty hush of the oil lamp flickering its final flame. In the dim chamber beneath the painted ceiling of constellations, he'd relieve his predecessor with a slow nod. No words, no gestures, just the ritual transfer of time. To the outsider, this moment might seem small, insignificant. But this act, this unbroken passing of the watch, was central to the very stability of Egyptian society. While the pharaoh ruled by decree and divine image, it was the temple priesthood that ruled by rhythm. Their careful observation of hours, their unwavering commitment to sacred schedule, ensured that the gods were honored, the cosmos remained in balance, and Egypt's great machinery of life continued unhindered. This section of our story takes you deeper into that machine, into the lives of the men whose sleepless nights lit the path for civilization. When time was sacred, not personal. In the modern world, time is measured personally. Our calendars, our alarms, our routines. But in ancient Egypt, time was communal and, more importantly, cosmic. The night was not divided for convenience, it was divided to reflect the movements of the Dayat, the underworld, through which the sun god Ra traveled each night. Each hour of darkness represented a specific challenge the sun god faced, and so each hour required a priest's presence, a chant, a flame, or a warding ritual to guide Ra on his journey. If Ra succeeded in his 12-hour voyage through the underworld, dawn would return. The sun would rise. The world would continue. But that continuation depended symbolically and ritually on the actions of a few sleepless men in hidden rooms, whispering incantations in time with burning oil. The priest was not waking up at 2 a.m. to pray. He was ensuring the survival of the world. It is a sobering thought, to be woken not by need or desire but by the responsibility to keep divine time on schedule. There was no personal alarm. There was communal memory, passed down through practice, habit, and observation. Who were the night priests? They were not high priests. The figures performing these nightly duties were often junior members of the temple hierarchy. Young men, scribes in training, initiates of the sacred order. They were expected to be disciplined, humble, and observant. Many were recruited from families of scribes or temple workers, their fathers having performed the same duties decades prior. Their education began with reading and writing hieratic script, learning astronomical alignments, understanding the Book of the Dead, and mastering the rhythms of sacred recitations. But their initiation into night watch was something else entirely. It was quiet, repetitive, and exhausting. They would learn to sleep in segments, to wake without clocks, to discern time through the smallest of shifts, the weight of a silence, the sputter of a dying flame, the pattern of incense curling in cold air. In this, they became living clocks. The architecture of time. Egyptian temples were designed not just for worship, but for controlling time. Their construction was intentional. Long corridors aligned with the stars, hidden chambers that remained cool and dark even during the blazing midday sun. These structures were more than religious monuments, they were time-regulating environments. Inside, the lack of natural light forced reliance on artificial measurement. You could not guess the hour by looking out a window. You had to know based on the oil level, or the pattern of tasks completed, or the hour's specific chant. Some temples, like those in Karnak, were vast enough to require rotating patrols. Priests would quietly circulate through corridors to ensure all flames were lit, chants recited, statues anointed. They were not guards in the traditional sense, but guardians of order. Every hallway, every door had a schedule. Time flowed through the building not as a passive presence, but as a ritual obligation. And if that rhythm broke, even once there was panic. When the lamp burned too fast. Consider the scenario. A priest lights his lamp, using exactly the volume of oil prescribed for 1 hour. He places the lamp at the altar, recites the necessary verses, and waits. But tonight the wind shifts. A breeze filters through a tiny opening, causing the flame to flicker higher. It burns faster. He doesn't notice. By the time his fellow priest arrives for the next hour, the lamp is nearly empty, a full hour lost. There is confusion, a missed chant, an unanswered prayer. To us, it might seem a small mistake, but in the temple it could provoke ritual purification, confessions, or even a redo of the entire night's process. There are fragments in temple records describing disordered rites, sometimes caused by missed hours or misread timepieces. These disruptions were taken seriously, as they were believed to unsettle the principle of universal balance and truth. Time was not neutral, it was moral, and to miskeep it was to err not just ritually but cosmologically. Sleep in the service of God. Modern sleep studies suggest ancient humans may have naturally practiced segmented sleep, waking for a few hours in the middle of the night before returning to rest. Egyptian temple priests may have functioned on a similar model, only their waking was scheduled, assigned, and rarely optional. They were expected to be alert, not groggy, not unfocused. Some texts even describe ritual baths or inhaling fragrant herbs before beginning a shift to ensure wakefulness and purity. But what did they do between duties? Some sat in meditation, chanting prayers mentally. Others copied scrolls. A few simply waited, observing the progress of the flame, eyes trained to the inching line of oil like a monk might watch falling sand. To be a night priest was to surrender personal comfort to communal obligation. They did not complain. Their role was sacred. Still, one imagines, especially during long festivals or fasts, the urge to snooze, to slip into sleep unnoticed, must have been profound. The oil clock's quiet genius. Let's dwell again on the oil clock, an unassuming but brilliant invention. These clocks were made of ceramic or bronze, with spouts to adjust the size of the flame and sometimes etched indicators along the side. More advanced versions, such as those described by later Egyptian engineers during the Greco-Roman period, included floats attached to sticks that would rise or fall as oil burned, providing a visual cue of time elapsed. This was no longer just a priest's intuition, it was a measurable instrument. Imagine a room completely silent except for the slight crackle of the flame. A priest sits beside the lamp, watching the float slowly descend as the oil is consumed. He notes the position and prepares for the next rite. No gears, no ticks, just time in its purest form, fire fatting in silence. This might be history's first analog night clock. A system for a civilization. Why did this matter? Because Egypt's temples were not just religious centers, they were also economic, political, and scientific hubs. The priesthood maintained granaries, tax records, astronomical observations, and legal decisions. To do this, they needed order. Their schedules, especially at night, ensured continuity, that each ritual was performed, that each statue was moved, each scroll was read, each god was fed. These routines regulated society far beyond the temple walls. And the oil lamps, burning night after night, made it possible. You might think of this system as an early bureaucracy of time. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't war. It was paperwork, prayer, and punctuality. But from that foundation emerged the long durability of Egyptian civilization. No empire lasts 3,000 years by improvisation alone. The sound of time before bells. There were no chiming clocks in these halls, but sometimes, especially in later periods, instruments were used to mark changes. Simple gongs, wooden clappers, even handheld sistrums rattles used in ritual could serve to mark hour changes. These weren't alarms as we know them. They were sound signals, subtle enough to stir a waiting priest, but not enough to disrupt the sanctity of the temple. These signals, repeated nightly, became ingrained in the body. Like monks today who wake without clocks, Egyptian priests likely trained themselves to rise at the expected sound, even in sleep. Thus, an entire generation of men became entrained to an unwritten clock, a rhythm not imposed by machines, but by discipline and collective trust. The human side of the system. We often imagine ancient history as faceless, but behind every oil lamp was a human being, tired, hungry, perhaps devoted, perhaps just obedient. Some may have resented the night shift. Others may have found solace in the silence, a moment to commune with gods without the noise of the day. Still others may have marveled at the stars overhead as they walked between chambers, wondering if Ra's journey mirrored their own. And in all this the oil clock burned quietly beside them, a companion, a taskmaster, a reminder. It was their alarm, it was their deadline, it was their vigil. An echo in our lives. The modern alarm clock is a jarring thing, a blaring tone, a vibration, a digital beep. But its spiritual ancestor was this, a flickering flame in a dark temple room, reminding a silent priest that the gods awaited. In our world of schedules and notifications, we have forgotten that timekeeping once required attention, not automation. And that once, long ago, a man woke not because a bell rang, but because he had learned to listen for the silence that followed a dying flame. A question in the darkness. So who taught the first priest to watch oil burn? Who realized that light could be a measure, not just a comfort? And when the last temple closed, when the rites were forgotten, and the lamps went out, who was the last priest to forget to wake? The power of the routine. It is easy to underestimate the power of habit in shaping a civilization. Wars and monuments may capture attention, but civilizations are more often held together by ritual, by repetition, and by systems so stable that they disappear into the background of daily life. By the New Kingdom period, circa 1550–1070 BCE, the system of nighttime temple watchkeeping in Egypt had become not just routine, but institutionalized. Young priests entered training already knowing the structure of the hours. Master scribes handed down knowledge of oil volumes, recitation durations, and shift transitions with the same precision one might use to train an engineer. And this institutionalization of timekeeping, especially nocturnal timekeeping, did not stop at temple doors. In this final section, we explore how the culture of measured time spread outward, to the state, to daily life, to agriculture, astronomy, empire, and ultimately to the world. The ripple effect, from temple to empire. The influence of the temples in Egypt cannot be overstated. They were more than religious centers. They were economic engines, political strongholds, educational institutions, and even health care providers. When a temple established a standard for something, whether it was timekeeping or grain measurement, it often became the standard for the region. So when priests began dividing the night into formal hours, it wasn't long before other institutions began adapting these divisions. Nobles began measuring their servants' tasks by hour, borrowing scheduling norms from temple routines. Administrators used temple calendars and hourly notations to track tax collection, canal operations, and cargo delivery. Builders and engineers coordinated tasks with references to night or dawn hours, even in projects far from temple grounds. In other words, what began as a sacred system became a civil tool. And while we do not find oil lamps in every village home marked with careful hour lines, the influence of this early time discipline reshaped expectations across the land. The sky is a partner. One of the most fascinating integrations of temple timekeeping was its relationship to the stars and specifically, the decanal stars. Egyptian astronomers divided the sky into groups of stars, decans, that rose and set at regular intervals throughout the night. Each decan appeared about 40 minutes after the previous one. By tracking these, priests could verify their internal clocks. Imagine a priest completing his hour-long ritual, checking the decan rising over the temple roof to confirm his timing. If the star appeared too soon or not at all, he would know that the oil had burned too fast or the chant too slowly. Some painted tombs contain star clocks, long lists of decans associated with hours of the night, often depicted above sleeping figures. These diagrams were not just symbolic. They were practical training tools, used to teach apprentices how to track time via the stars. Here oil and astronomy met. Flame and starlight both used to count the hours. A priest might enter his shift by lighting a lamp and looking upward, not to pray, but to calibrate his timepiece. Bureaucracy needs time. As Egypt's administration became more complex, it began to require greater precision in record keeping. Consider the management of agricultural surpluses. The timing of the Nile's flood dictated planting schedules, but the storage, distribution, and taxation of grain all required tracking by intervals, particularly during flood season, when fields were inaccessible and timing was critical. Temples, with their established hourly divisions, became the unofficial chronometers of the state. Their keepers of ritual also became keepers of logistics. Storage cycles were measured in watches. Labor shifts for canal maintenance began aligning with night and day hour divisions. Boat traffic across the Nile was scheduled according to temple bells and gongs that echoed over the water-crude but effective public alarms. The slow, dull work of knowing the time was what allowed large systems to work. Sleep as a structured sacrifice. By the time of the late period, circa 664–332 BCE, the nightly schedules of temple priests had become more rigid. Detailed records describe rotating watches, with set duties and durations, enforced by temple officials. Priests would sleep for 4 hours, then work for 2, then return to rest only to rise again before dawn for purification and morning ritual. Sleep was a fragmented, managed resource, treated as a sacrifice for the greater good. There are references in Ostraca to disciplinary measures for priests who failed to appear for their shift on time, not because they were lazy, but because time was now a contract. A missed hour could not be replaced. Some priests developed methods for staying alert, massaging oils with stimulating herbs, placing cold stone tablets against their cheeks, or simply repeating mantra-like phrases under their breath to stay awake. This deep training, spiritual, mental, physical, wasn't merely religious. It was a form of human engineering designed to produce reliable behavior under fatigue. A quiet but powerful precursor to industrial scheduling. The long arc of influence. Egypt's nighttime alarms did not remain isolated. As Egypt engaged with and was eventually ruled by foreign empires, first the Assyrians, then Persians, then Greeks and Romans, its temple systems became subjects of fascination. The Greeks observed Egyptian timekeeping and adopted water clocks of their own clepsydry used in courts and public speaking arenas. The Romans expanded on these ideas to create mechanical devices, including early tower clocks powered by flowing water. The Islamic world, inheriting Greek and Egyptian science, created elaborate astronomical clocks, some of which included call-to-prayer mechanisms, true spiritual alarms. Eventually, medieval Europe, through contact with Islamic scholars and the preserved knowledge of antiquity, began constructing bell towers and clock-driven churches, continuing the old Egyptian habit of waking communities for sacred duty. It is not an exaggeration to say that the sleepy ritual of the Egyptian temple priest became the seed of global time discipline. And it all began with oil and silence. The last flicker. By the time Egypt came under Roman rule, circa 30 BCE, many of the old temple systems had been weakened. The grandeur of Karnak remained, but the power of ritual time had shifted to administrators, merchants, and governors. Religion faded from the clock, and bureaucracy took its place. Still, echoes remained. A few remaining temples, especially in Upper Egypt, continued to maintain night watches, their oil clocks quietly flickering even as the world outside modernized. But eventually, the lamps were extinguished. Not because the system had failed, but because it had succeeded too well. Time had become a habit, and habits once spiritual can be absorbed into society without a trace of their origin. We still wake like pharaohs. Today, we don't light oil lamps to wake at 2 a.m. We set alarms, we count minutes, we regulate schedules, and we rarely ask why. But if you peel back the layers beneath the screen glow of your digital clock, beneath the chime of your smartphone, you find the same impulse. To measure what is unmeasurable. To wake at the right time. To perform our duties, even in darkness. This is the inheritance of the night priests. They didn't invent the modern alarm, but they created the context that made alarms possible. They made time reliable, habitable, sacred. They made night structured, and in doing so, helped shape the way civilizations function. Final reflection. So the next time your alarm buzzes before dawn, and you groggily reach to silence it, pause. You are not alone. Somewhere in the back corridors of time, a priest is walking barefoot across cold temple stone, holding a flickering lamp, listening for the silence that means his shift has begun. He is awake, not because he wants to be, but because he knows the gods are waiting. And perhaps so is the world. Story 2. The Empire of Accountants: How Clay Tablets Built Mesopotamia. In the dim morning haze along the banks of the Euphrates River, the city of Uruk stirred. This was not the rustle of armies or the clamor of markets. It was the quiet, persistent rhythm of administration: reeds scratching wet clay, seals stamping tablets, and scribes counting goods in whispered tones. This was the dawn of bureaucracy, and at the heart of it was not a king or a warrior, but a clerk bent over a slab of clay, stylus in hand, recording the daily outputs of grain, goats, and beer. In a world before money, before writing as literature, and long before borders were mapped, Mesopotamia invented a different kind of empire, one ruled by accountants. This story, dry as the sun-baked clay they used, is perhaps one of the most overlooked in all of history. Yet it is arguably one of the most important, for without it there is no tax, no record, no law, no state, just chaos and memory. Let us begin with the most boring but foundational task in all early human civilization: counting barley. The age of accounting before the alphabet. Long before alphabets and literature, the people of southern Mesopotamia, particularly in Sumer, used cuneiform not to tell stories, but to manage things. The earliest surviving tablets, dating from around 3100 BCE, do not describe myths or battles. They are receipts. 4,500 liters of barley delivered. 30 sheep moved to temple pens. 1 day's rations for 12 workers. These weren't exceptional events. They were ordinary, repetitive, and deeply boring entries. And yet, this mundane record-keeping built a civilization. How? Because the complexity of urban living with temples, irrigation, armies, and laborers required reliable systems of measurement, distribution, and enforcement. You couldn't grow a city of 20,000 people on oral tradition alone. So they wrote. Not on scrolls, not in books, but on clay tablets, using styluses made from reed stalks. And what they wrote were not poems, but inventory logs. Barley, the boring bedrock of civilization. Why barley? Because in Mesopotamia, barley was currency, calorie, and contract. Every temple and palace controlled vast grain stores, measured down to the last handful. Barley was grown in meticulously irrigated fields, harvested seasonally, and stored in massive silos, some of the oldest forms of central infrastructure. Scribes were trained to calculate expected yield per unit of land, labor days per task, tilling, planting, reaping, ration sizes for various laborers based on status, gender, and role. Imagine the spreadsheet, only it wasn't digital. It was in rows of wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay, dried in the sun, and stored in archives. To read these tablets today is to read a story of daily survival, told not in drama, but in quantities and units. 120 liters of barley to the brewer, 60 liters to the potter, 6 liters to the temple singer female. Each entry matters. Each scribal mark ensured that a worker ate, that a god was appeased with offerings, or that a tax was collected. And at the heart of it all was a scribe, quietly recording a world in numbers. Learning to write to count. Scribes trained for years to master cuneiform. The script was not alphabetic but logophonetic, a mix of signs that represented entire words or syllables. Its learning curve was steep. Young boys, usually sons of elites or other scribes, would begin by copying lists. Lists of objects, fish, cows, baskets. Lists of professions, weaver, butcher, brewer. Lists of quantities and numerical systems. It was rote, it was tedious, it was deliberate. Tablets from scribal schools called edubas show endless repetitions of phrases like 1 sheep, 2 goats, 3 pots of oil. Later, these students would learn more complex ratios, trade accounting, and legal formulations. Mistakes were common and rarely forgiven. A single miswritten unit could misallocate a week's worth of grain or wrongly accuse a person of debt. In this way, scribes were not just writers, they were data analysts, project managers, and civil servants rolled into one. And they rarely received glory for their efforts. The bureaucracy of temples. The earliest institutions in Mesopotamia were not governments as we know them, but temples, complex economic and religious hubs that owned land, employed workers, and oversaw production. Temple bureaucrats managed livestock herds, rotated seasonally, beer production made from surplus barley, craft workshops producing goods from copper, textiles, and leather, seasonal labor contracts, often with rotating corvée, forced labor systems. All of this required precise documentation. The temples maintained enormous tablet archives, which archaeologists have unearthed in mounds of crumbling clay. These archives are not dramatic. They're boring by design, built to track minutiae. Delivery of 3 cows to the temple of Inanna. Cows inspected, all healthy. Witnessed by Enlilbani, head scribe. But from these dull records, we learn everything about how the Sumerians lived, worked, and organized themselves. No epic poem gives this kind of detail. It is only by understanding the boring that we can truly reconstruct the real. Bureaucracy as survival strategy. Mesopotamia was not an easy place to live. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was fertile but also volatile. Drought, flooding, and war were constant threats. In this environment, efficiency and record-keeping were survival strategies. If a village lost track of how much grain it had stored, it might not survive the next dry season. If a temple could not verify its livestock, it might fall into ritual debt with the gods. If a caravan shipment went unrecorded, it could disappear along with the goods and taxes attached to it. Thus, scribes became guardians of continuity. Their work was repetitive, redundant, and unglamorous, but it kept the system functioning. Without them, there would be no empire of any kind, only a scattering of huts along muddy rivers. A day in the life of a scribe. Imagine the routine. A scribe wakes just before sunrise. He eats flatbread, maybe a date. At the temple, he checks in with the head accountant. A shipment of copper from the east has arrived. He must record the weights. He walks among the unloading workers, stylus and tablet in hand. He notes the merchant's seal, the types of goods, the accompanying rations for workers. He returns to the storage area to log outgoing grain rations, 40 liters to the brickmakers, 30 to the river crews, 5 to the temple singer. He copies the data into the master archive, then takes a copy to the temple's chief priest, who must bless the distribution before the next cycle begins. Nothing is glamorous, but everything matters. Time without clocks. Interestingly, there is no evidence of mechanical clocks in Mesopotamia. Yet bureaucratic work was still scheduled by sun positions, by shadows, by temple bells, and by routine. The work of scribes likely followed seasonal rhythms, punctuated by new moon ceremonies, harvest festivals, tax seasons aligned with planting and reaping cycles. In this way, Mesopotamian timekeeping was calendar-based, not clock-based, but it was no less strict. A missed entry, a delayed shipment, or a failed offering could disrupt the fragile equilibrium of the state. So while there were no alarms, schedules were sacred and scribes were expected to conform precisely. An early case of paperwork fatigue. Some tablets contain scribal complaints, written in dry humor or frustration. My back aches from writing, my eyes are dim. The reed pen fails me, the clay dries too quickly. Another day, another list of barley. Even 5,000 years ago, administrative exhaustion was real. But through these complaints, we see the humanity behind the system, people who did tedious work not because it was exciting, but because it was necessary. Their boredom built permanence, their repetition built memory. A question in the clay. As we close this section, consider the strange irony. The first written words in human history were not epics or philosophies, they were inventories. Why? Because when survival depends on knowing what you have, counting comes before dreaming. But what happens when the counters begin to rule, when numbers replace names, when the bureaucrat becomes more powerful than the king? And how did this humble clay tablet become the foundation of law, economy, and empire? In the royal city of Lagash, in the late 3rd millennium BCE, a courier arrived at the palace gates not with a proclamation of war or tribute from a distant land, but with something more powerful, a tablet. Small, rectangular, and sun-dried, it bore the seal of the temple accountant, a cylinder rolled in precise patterns across the wet clay, authenticating its contents. The courier held no sword. The tablet contained no decree, yet it could shift resources, alter contracts, even resolve disputes between noblemen. This was the power of recorded data in the ancient world. It wasn't the king who always made things happen. It was the tablet and the system behind it. In Mesopotamia, the rise of writing gave rise not just to communication, but to a new kind of authority, the authority of numbers. Numbers as law. By the time of the Ur-III dynasty, circa 2100–2000 BCE, Mesopotamian accounting had become systematized to an astonishing degree. Central authorities collected and redistributed resources on a massive scale: grain, cattle, metals, labor. To manage this, they developed systems that feel shockingly familiar. Standardized weights and measures. Auditable accounts stored in temple archives. Signed documentation using personal seals. Duplication of records, an original for the official archive, a copy for the merchant or laborer. This system created a state bureaucracy driven by documentation. The tablet, sealed and verified, was binding. In many cases, judges used these records to resolve disputes. If one man claimed his neighbor had shorted him a harvest, a scribe might retrieve the original barley receipt from the temple. If it bore the proper seal, that was the final word. In essence, the tablet was law. The temple as tax collector. We might imagine temples as purely spiritual places, but in Mesopotamia, they were also the IRS, the Bank of England, and the Federal Reserve rolled into one. Scribes and priests worked side by side. When taxes were due, usually in the form of goods or labor collection, was recorded by temple scribes. A tenant farmer might bring 150 liters of grain as rent. A merchant might deliver fine wool in exchange for copper. A craftsperson might owe 2 weeks of labor to repair temple walls. Every exchange, every duty, every obligation recorded in clay. And from these records, not just debts but entire economic systems emerged. Even the temple itself owed duties to the state. Some temples had to send portions of their income to royal centers. Others provided workers for public building projects. All of it logged, stamped, reviewed. It wasn't just divine favor that kept the system running. It was compliance through documentation. The birth of bureaucratic hierarchy. As the scale of record-keeping grew, so too did the need for administrative layers. By the time of the Akkadian Empire, circa 2330 BCE, most cities had junior scribes to prepare raw entries, senior scribes to verify calculations, chief accountants to oversee resources, archivists to store and retrieve tablets, auditors to ensure accuracy and detect fraud. Sound familiar? This was not some informal process. It was a functioning bureaucracy with roles, procedures, and even performance expectations. An inscription from the time of Shulgi, king of Ur, boasts not of conquest but of administrative reform. I put in order the scribal accounting of the temple. The fields were measured by rope, the silos made full, and the barley counted without error. He didn't just build monuments, he built metrics. Inventory as religion. Mesopotamian religion demanded offerings, food, drink, incense, and livestock delivered to the gods in their temple homes. But gods did not eat or drink, not literally. Their portions were redistributed to temple personnel, from priests to gardeners. And those redistributions were meticulously recorded. A tablet from the temple of Nippur reads, to Enlil, 2 ducks, 1 goat, 5 liters beer. Temple priest, 3 liters beer, 1 duck. Scribe, 2 liters beer, 1 loaf. The gods may have been immortal, but their rituals were human, and humans needed accounting. This routine, dull, transactional layer of religion, the delivery, inspection, redistribution, and recording of offerings, is perhaps the most important part of ancient temple activity. It turned spiritual obligation into economic structure. And it required not mystics, but administrators. The clay archive. What happens when you produce tens of thousands of tablets? You build an archive. In cities like Uruk, Sippar, and Ebla, entire rooms were dedicated to storing these clay records. Shelves lined the walls. Tablets were categorized by content: labor, land, rations, taxes, legal rulings. Some temples used envelopes, outer clay shells encasing the tablet, sealed for authentication. These acted like notarized letters. Others used summary tablets, small digest versions listing the totals of a much larger set of records. Scribes developed filing systems. Some archives were even organized by year, with calendar references drawn from the reigning king's regnal year. Example: Year 4 of King Amr-Sin, harvest records of barley for the western field. In many ways, this is the beginning of government archiving, the principle that information must be preserved, traceable, and retrievable. When clerks dethroned kings, there are tablets, especially from the later periods, suggesting that scribes held more real power than rulers. Kings came and went, but scribes maintained control of land registries, tax rolls, inheritance claims, temple debts. An illiterate king was dependent on his scribes for understanding his own wealth. He might command armies, but he couldn't calculate tribute without their records. In some cases, scribes manipulated numbers for their own gain. A clever accounting official might underreport incoming goods or delay postings to favor a relative. There were no spreadsheets, but fraud still existed and audits did too. Records from the city of Umma contain notations like, reviewed by Dubsar, 5 goats unaccounted for, inquiry pending. This is the world's first financial red flag. In truth, the real empire wasn't built by kings or gods. It was built by the men who managed the margins. When writing became law, one of the most famous documents from Mesopotamia is the Code of Hammurabi, circa 1754 BCE, a large stone stele etched with legal proclamations. But the law did not begin there. Long before this code, scribes were recording contracts, debts, loans, and penalties in clay. A sample loan tablet might read, 30 liters of barley borrowed from the temple granary. Due in 60 days. Interest 10%. Witnessed by Lunana, temple scribe. If the borrower failed to repay, the record would be reviewed. Additional entries might be added to the tablet. Sometimes, a second tablet would record repayment with cross-reference to the first. This practice, cross-indexed legal record-keeping, is the seed of modern contract law. And again, it was driven not by lawyers, but by accountants. The culture of calculation. Eventually, Mesopotamian culture became one of calculating people. They tracked days lived, lunar cycles, debt repayment schedules, divination patterns, work rotations. The scribe's skill with numbers and abstraction laid the groundwork for other sciences, astronomy, geometry, and eventually algebra. But even these achievements emerged first from bureaucratic needs. To predict harvests, you must understand the moon. To measure land, you must understand area. To plan labor, you must understand cycles. From need came abstraction. From abstraction came science. But it all started with, how many sheep do we have? A question buried in tablets. Thousands of Mesopotamian tablets remain untranslated, sitting in museum archives and excavation sites. Most are not epics. They are spreadsheets in clay. And yet they represent one of humanity's greatest inventions, the systematization of information. But we must ask, when systems become more important than people, when the record matters more than the life it describes, do we begin to serve the tablet rather than the truth? The sun was setting over Nippur, one of Mesopotamia's oldest sacred cities. In the cool shadow of its ziggurat, temple clerks were still busy, as they had been for centuries. Clay tablets lay drying on reed mats. Apprentices double-checked rations and tax notations. The archivist slid new entries into storage niches carved from mudbrick. And then one day there was silence. The building was abandoned. The records stayed behind. Kilns went cold. Styluses dried. The clay tablets, thousands of them, were left where they had always been, untouched for millennia. The collapse of Mesopotamian bureaucratic systems was not marked by a dramatic speech or sweeping invasion. It was more subtle, gradual disruptions in routine, drought, invasion, declining trust in institutions, the death of trade networks, the erosion of central authority. The temple archive, once the engine of an empire, became a tomb. The story of how that happened is a lesson in how civilizations collapse not through drama, but through breakdowns in administration. When the system breaks, by the early first millennium BCE, the once mighty cities of Ur, Lagash, and Eridu were shells of their former selves. The temples still stood, and the canals still flowed in part, but the scribes were fewer, the archives thinner, the flow of data so essential for feeding, taxing, and regulating society began to slow. Here is what we know from archaeological layers and tablet sequences. Record frequency drops. Where once hundreds of tablets were produced each year, we begin to find only dozens. Personal seals disappear. The seal impressions that authenticated documents begin to vanish or show signs of reuse. Ration systems break down. Workers pay in barley and oil becomes erratic. Debt disputes increase. More and more tablets record unpaid loans, runaway laborers, and legal grievances. Public works falter, canals silted up, fields went fallow, grain storage collapsed. The system that had once been resilient through droughts and dynastic change was eroding from within. At its core, the failure was not technological, it was administrative. The empire forgot how to count itself. The forgotten scribe. Imagine a lone scribe still loyal to a temple whose power is fading. He rises each morning to an empty hall. His stylus is worn, his clay too dry. The granaries echo with silence. The grain is gone or never came. Still he records. Day 7 of the 12th month, no barley received. Worker ration not fulfilled, reason unrecorded. There's no priest to review it, no official to stamp it, but the record is made because that's what scribes do. Eventually, he stops writing. His last tablets are left beside the older ones. Centuries later, archaeologists will find them perfectly preserved, a fossil of bureaucracy. We will never know his name, but we will know his calm dedication to procedure, even as the system around him failed. From clay to dust. In many Mesopotamian cities, libraries and archives were burned not by accident, but through conquest and collapse. Ironically, fire often preserved the tablets, baking them permanently. When the Assyrians conquered Babylon, or when the Elamites sacked Ur, they didn't steal the archives. They destroyed them or ignored them entirely. What use is a record of barley quotas when there's no government to honor it? And so, in cities like Mari and Ebla, vast archives were left to crumble under ash and dust. The tablets, once the nervous system of an empire, became just another layer in the archaeological record. The clerks were gone. Their world, made of rows and columns, of lentils and loaves, of goats and silver rings, was gone. What we found in the dust. When 19th and 20th century archaeologists began excavating Mesopotamian ruins, they were initially disappointed. They hoped for treasure. What they found was paperwork. Tens of thousands of tablets. At first, these seemed unimportant, but gradually scholars realized this is the civilization, not the palaces, not the weapons, not even the art. The true innovation of Mesopotamia was its information infrastructure. These tablets told us how they fed cities of tens of thousands without markets, how they governed without police forces, relying on contracts and temple oversight, how they regulated labor with fairness, redundancy, and checks, how they recorded personal histories, sometimes the only evidence that someone existed, how time was tracked, measured, allocated, long before mechanical clocks. In modern terms, these tablets were databases, and the people who managed them were system administrators. The long legacy of a short list. Mesopotamia's bureaucracy inspired future civilizations in quiet but critical ways. The Egyptians adopted clay-based accounting in the Old Kingdom and developed papyrus logbooks. The Persians used cuneiform administration to manage their multi-ethnic empire through satrapies. The Greeks, though skeptical of bureaucracy, retained administrative systems inspired by Babylonian models. The Romans, perhaps the most bureaucratically minded of all, inherited and refined these practices. Audits, censuses, tax collection, ledgers, and even military payroll systems. And in the Islamic Golden Age, Scholars preserved and studied Babylonian accounting, using it to support taxation, trade, and irrigation. Even today, when we use ledgers, seals, now digital, calendars, and official notarizations, we are echoing the first clerks of the Fertile Crescent. The habits they formed out of clay shaped the steel and silicon that would follow. Civilization is boring, and that's why it works. We often look to history for heroes, revolutions, and empires. But what holds a society together are not dramatic battles or bold decrees. It's a clerk writing down grain receipts, a junior scribe reviewing a livestock roster for duplication, an archivist ensuring the tablet is filed under the right year and ruler. None of it is thrilling, none of it glamorous. But without it, everything else collapses. Civilization is only as strong as its ability to count, store, retrieve, and verify. That's what makes large-scale cooperation possible. That's what turns a collection of villages into a state. And that is the true power of the Mesopotamian accountant. A quiet ending. We do not know who wrote the last cuneiform record. Perhaps it was in a minor temple during the Seleucid period, just before paper and ink began to take over. Perhaps the last tablet was never even fired, just dried in the sun and crumbled in the rain. The writing stopped, the system stopped, and yet it all survived. Because someone, thousands of years later, read what they left behind. The numbers, the lists, the seals, the tallies, all the routines and reminders became the foundation of our own administrative minds. Final reflection. The Mesopotamians didn't build great walls like the Chinese. They didn't craft intricate legal debates like the Romans. They didn't write epics for entertainment like the Greeks. But they gave us something more permanent, the structure of record keeping. Without it, we do not know who we are. We do not remember. We do not plan. And perhaps that is the most important and most boring lesson in all of history. The act of writing down the truth every day, faithfully, without glory, is what keeps civilization alive. Story 3. The Roman laundrymen and the emperor's urine tax. A city that stank of soap. You are walking through Subura, a densely packed Roman district near the Forum. It's the early 1st century CE, and the city is alive with clamor, vendors shouting, carts rattling on stone, and people bustling through narrow lanes. But beneath all that noise is an unmistakable smell. Not the sweet aroma of bread or roasted meat, not the tang of fish sauce or incense from a nearby temple. No, this smell is sharper, pungent, acrid, almost unbearable. It's urine. Welcome to the neighborhood of the fullers, the laundrymen of Rome. These working-class professionals clad in tunics stained from labor operate one of the city's least glamorous, most necessary, and oddly influential industries, cleaning clothes with pee. This is not metaphor, this is real history. And the story of how they operated, organized, and even got taxed for collecting urine is one of those quiet, odd, but deeply revealing parts of Roman life that rarely gets told. It's not about legions or emperors, though emperors do make an appearance. It's about soiled tunics, soap vats, and civic necessity. The trade of the fullones. The Latin word for a fuller was fullo, plural, fullones. These men and sometimes women performed an essential but messy service, cleaning garments, especially woolen togas and tunics, that had become grimy, oily, or stiff with sweat and street dust. The process wasn't simple. In fact, it was a multi-stage chemical operation, conducted long before germ theory or commercial soap. Hear how it worked. Soaking in ammonia. Clothes were soaked in large vats of liquid, sometimes water, sometimes mixtures of full-strength urine collected from public urinals. Treading and pounding. Workers would stomp on the clothing with their bare feet, kneading it in the liquid to break down oils and dirt. Think of it as grape stomping, but for soiled linen. Soaping and scouring. Ancient detergents made from clay, lye, or ashes were rubbed into fabric to finish the cleaning. Rinsing in running water. Garments were finally rinsed in clean water, often in separate basins or small aqueduct-fed channels. Drying, brushing, and sulfur fuming. To whiten the fabric, some fullers hung it over sulfur pots, letting fumes bleach and disinfect it. Brushes made from thistles or reeds were used to raise the nap on wool garments. This process took skill, time, and a certain indifference to smell. It was labor-intensive and critical to Roman social norms. In a society obsessed with appearance, a freshly whitened toga was not optional, it was expected, and the Pharaohs made that possible. The business of bothering the gods. Inscriptions and graffiti across Pompeii and Ostia reveal how organized the Pharaohs were. They formed guilds, elected leaders, dedicated altars to patron gods, especially Minerva, the goddess of crafts, and even sponsored public events. In Pompeii, for example, a guild of fullers funded repairs to a public bath and supported a local candidate for political office. Their collective influence wasn't enormous, but it was felt. Yet they were also widely mocked. Fullers were seen as dirty, smelly, and low status. The Roman elite often made jokes at their expense. Still, everyone used them. Even senators, even the emperor's own household. There were no washing machines, no laundresses for hire at the elite level. You sent your tunics to the local Phalanca and trusted a man with filthy sandals to make them white again. The public urinal economy. Here, where things get weirder. Because fullers relied on urine for cleaning, and because urine was a household waste product, Rome developed a surprisingly efficient supply chain: public urinals. These were often amphorae or jars placed in alleyways or beside bathhouses. Citizens, especially men, were encouraged to relieve themselves in these containers rather than in the street. The fullers then collected this urine. At first, it was informal, but as cities like Rome grew and urban hygiene became more pressing, the state recognized an opportunity. Why not tax the collectors? This brings us to one of the most curiously practical moments in Roman economic history. Vespasian and the P tax. Emperor Vespasian, who ruled from 69-79 CE, inherited a nearly bankrupt empire after the civil wars of the Year of the Four Emperors. Known for his blunt pragmatism, he sought income wherever it could be found. One such measure, the urine tax vectigal urani. Rather than tax the fullers directly, he taxed the purchase of urine from public urinals. Since fullers relied on this liquid ammonia, and since it was technically public waste, it was now the emperor's to tax. Collectors, middlemen who retrieved urine from jars and resold it to fullers, paid a fee for the privilege. According to Roman historian Suetonius, when Vespasian's son Titus mocked the tax as unseemly, the emperor supposedly held a coin to his nose and asked, "Does it smell?" When Titus answered no, Vespasian replied, "Yet it comes from urine." This is the origin of the famous Latin phrase, pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink, even when it's made from pee. Industrial scale stain removal. Archaeologists have discovered phalaniki laundries in multiple Roman towns. The most complete example comes from Pompeii, where a large complex features stepping vats for trampling clothes, collection basins, channels fed by aqueducts, workrooms for pressing and brushing. These weren't small family shops. Some of these facilities processed hundreds of garments per day and employed dozens of workers. In fact, the fullers may be Rome's earliest wet lab industrial workers. Their tools were primitive, but their approach, multi-step chemical treatment, process stations, standardization, was surprisingly modern. And all of it smelled terrible. What you wore was someone else's job. To understand the importance of fullers, imagine the average Roman citizen. You own 2 tunics, one for work, one for public appearances. You sweat daily, live in dust, walk through streets full of animal droppings. You bathe in communal baths, but your clothes, they need help. So every few days, you drop your garments off with the fullers. They know you. They recognize your seal or name tag sewn into your collar. You pay a few sesterces, or maybe you owe them a favor from last time. Your clothes go through the stomp, the rinse, the fumes. You return to find them maybe not fresh smelling, but clean, white, and socially acceptable. The fullers weren't just laundry workers. They were gatekeepers of decency. Without them, Rome would stink far worse than it already did. From low work, high structure. The fullers weren't elites, they worked with waste, yet they formed legal guilds, paid taxes, were regulated by local magistrates, trained apprentices, funded public works. Some even owned their shops, workers, and real estate. The most successful were middle-class business people in a rigid society that rarely allowed upward mobility. And because their work was necessary and routine, it gained protection under the law even as it remained socially stigmatized. The smell of bureaucracy. Vespasian's P-tax wasn't the only time Rome monetized the waste economy. There were also taxes on Nitzel collection, tanners who also used urine, public bath drainage. All of these industries had one thing in common. They dealt in unpleasant byproducts of urban life. And so the Roman state, ever pragmatic, found a way to formalize the stink. Where other empires might have ignored or hidden the dirty work, Rome embraced it, organized it, and taxed it. A question in the suds. How many civilizations have built empires on something as humble as laundry? In Rome, the fullers weren't noble. They weren't storytellers or soldiers, but they were infrastructure. They didn't build roads, but they made sure the people walking them looked respectable. And their contribution reminds us, is civilization measured by monuments, or by how well it launders its linens? In a Roman world built on hierarchy, class, and appearances, laundry was not merely hygiene, it was a social signal. A soiled toga might suggest laziness, poverty, or even political disfavor. A clean, well-pressed garment, that meant you were respectable, perhaps pious, and most definitely part of the social order. It didn't matter if your home was small, your meals modest, or your status low. As long as you presented yourself clean and white in public, you could pass in Roman society. But here's the irony. The person who made that possible, the fullo, was someone you probably wouldn't invite into your home. The Roman laundryman was essential, but invisible, necessary, but socially odorous. In a world obsessed with ritual cleanliness, he dealt in other people's filth, working with human waste to produce the illusion of dignity. And so this section explores the deep contradiction at the heart of Roman society, that those who enforced standards of appearance were excluded from enjoying them. The Phalanca and the Forum. Let's return to Pompeii, where a well-preserved Phalanca, a Roman laundry, stands near the Forum, the civic and commercial heart of the city. Its location is telling. You might expect a laundry that reeks of ammonia and sulfur to be tucked away. But here, the laundry sat in full view, close to elite homes, temples, and public gathering spots. Why? Because despite their smell, fullers provided a critical service. Even wealthy homes used them. Even magistrates needed their ceremonial togas cleaned for festivals and processions. In this case, necessity trumped discomfort. Their presence was tolerated, even respected within boundaries. But they weren't embraced socially. We find no records of elite Romans marrying into fullers' families, no senators rising from a laundryman's lineage. Their economic influence was real, but their status remained stained. Smelling poor, smelling clean. In ancient Rome, smell was political. To smell good was to be civilized. To smell foul was to be unclean physically, morally, and socially. But the Fullers lived in a paradox. They created cleanliness, but worked in an environment that reeked of excrement and sulfur. The irony wasn't lost on satirists like Juvenal and Martial, who mocked the laundrymen and their stinking shops, even while acknowledging their usefulness. Roman philosopher Seneca, a Stoic, once remarked that we must learn to endure that which is beneath us, including smell, likely referring to people of lower classes, Fullers included. In effect, Rome outsourced its moral expectations cleanliness, whiteness, dignity to a class of people it refused to fully recognize. They were Rome's sanitation workers, industrial chemists and social janitors, and no one wanted to sit next to them at dinner. Ritual, reputation, and recycled waste. In Roman religion, appearance mattered. Priests had to wear immaculate robes. So did magistrates during public events. So did brides and senators and actors. And the Fullers ensured that these rituals could happen. Even death required them. Funeral togas, often bleached to a ceremonial white, had to be processed quickly for burial rites. A family in mourning might send messengers straight to the Phalanca, requesting an urgent wash before the cremation. And yet, it was the same tools used for death, purity, and ritual that processed waste. Urine, ash, sulfur. Rome had no qualms about recycling waste for cleanliness. What mattered was result and ritual, not source. A fuller could handle urine all morning, then produce a tunic fit for a priest by dusk. And somehow, that made sense to the Romans. Guilds, dirty hands, clean ledgers. By the 1st century CE, the guilds of fullers had organized themselves into semi-official professional associations. These guilds trained apprentices, sometimes under binding multi-year contracts, regulated pricing for different types of services, contributed taxes, especially under Vespasian's reforms, sponsored altars and festivals, often to Minerva or Hercules, engaged in civic life, backing political candidates and funding public benches or fountains. While not part of the elite, the Fullers' Guilds gave voice to working-class professionals, forming an early form of labor identity. Evidence from inscriptions in Ostia, Rome's port city, suggests Fullers attended city council meetings, represented their profession in legal disputes, and even filed grievances against unfair taxation. They may have cleaned tunics, but they kept detailed records, knew the law, and understood their economic leverage. In a real sense, they were small business owners navigating an ancient capitalist economy. Laundry as a legacy. Here's a curious thing. Many Phalanci remained in operation for generations. Sons inherited their father's shops. Apprentices eventually became masters. Techniques were passed down not through texts, but by hand, by habit, and by proximity. This stability is rare in antiquity. While wars raged, emperors rose and fell, and borders shifted, the routine of washing clothes with ammonia and clay remained constant. It suggests a hidden resilience beneath Roman society, an underlayer of quiet, smelly, essential activity that kept the city running, even when politics failed. Perhaps that's why Rome, despite its civil wars and assassinations, remained stable for so long, not because of its legions, but because of its laundrymen. Humor in the smell. Romans were nothing if not candid about their bodily functions. Public toilets were communal. Baths were social spaces. Satirical poetry was filled with references to excrement and odor. So Fuller's smelly, sweaty, but necessary made for easy punchlines. Martial jokes that Fullers washed souls as poorly as tunics. Plautus includes a character who laments being treated worse than a washer's footwater. Graffiti in Pompeii reads, "Apels the Fuller the best, except for the smell." This humor wasn't cruel, but class-coded. It was a way of asserting superiority while acknowledging reliance. Much like modern jokes about garbage collectors or janitors, It reflected discomfort with those who handle what others wish to ignore. The economics of soap. Let's talk soap, because the Romans didn't have bars of it as we know today. Their cleaning agents included urine ammonia, breaks down oil and grease. Clay or fuller's earth, absorbs moisture and dirt. Ash lye, a primitive alkaline solution. Soda ash, extracted from burnt plant matter. Sulfur, used for fumigation and whitening. These were cheap, abundant, and effective. What's fascinating is how Roman fullers developed standard mixtures and practices, not unlike modern chemical formulations. Some shops offered premium services, adding fragrances, using cleaner water, or offering quicker turnaround. There was a laundry economy, with price differentiation, customer loyalty, and even competition between Phalanaki. It's capitalism in tunics. When Rome burned, so did the wash. There is no record of how fullers responded during disasters, fires, plagues, sackings, but we know that when Pompeii was buried, its Phalanica was mid-operation. Clothes lay folded. Water channels remained intact. Foot-shaped impressions stood in the stepping vats. Even in the moment of sudden destruction, the laundry was being done. There's something touching about that. That life's most repetitive, tedious chore, washing clothes, was underway at the very end. A reminder that civilization doesn't stop with grand decisions, but with quiet routines. And maybe that's the legacy of the fullers, the last workers standing, even when the world ends. A question in the foam. What does it mean that the most powerful city in the ancient world outsourced its respectability to men who stomped in human waste? And what does it say about us that thousands of years later, we still separate the idea of cleanliness from the work that makes it possible? We like to think of ourselves as advanced, hygienic, and above the stink. But perhaps every society needs someone to say, "Yes, I will clean that. Yes, I will make your robe white." Even when the cost is smell, stigma, and silence. Even as the Western Roman Empire began to crack under the weight of its own size, its debt, and its shifting borders, the fullers' shops kept operating. Rome could afford to lose provinces, but it could not afford to lose its launderers. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the Roman economy had entered a period of stress. Inflation soared, coinage was debased, military payrolls grew unpredictable, and civil unrest became commonplace. Yet amid these troubles, Phalanaki still appear in archaeological layers. Why? Because they represented something almost eternal in urban life, the need to appear clean in public. Even when trade routes were under threat, when emperors were overthrown in quick succession, and when civil war returned to the empire, the essential rhythms of city life endured among them. The ritual of laundering one's garments before stepping into the forum, the basilica, or the bathhouse. Fullers didn't clean clothes for the glory of Rome. They did it because people had to show up somewhere looking presentable. Politics might crumble, armies might retreat, but the toga still needed to be white. The smell of empire. Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century CE, describes Rome as a place of luxury, pretense, and crowded tenements. But he also describes the bustling workshops, including those of fullers, operating beside taverns, bakers, and barbers. In short, even as the ideological unity of the empire fractured, its urban infrastructure kept functioning, driven by small trades, not imperial policies. And in those neighborhoods, you could still find fullers, beating garments with wooden paddles, stomping cloth in stepping vats, rinsing wool in aqueduct-fed basins, fumigating tunics with sulfur, and bargaining over how much ammonia-rich urine had been used in a cleaning process. The smell persisted, so did the service. The smell was the smell of function, of persistence, of empire without ceremony. The empire on autopilot. In modern analysis of decline, Historians often point out that empires don't end overnight. They fade, leaving their infrastructures running on inertia. That's exactly what happened in Rome. Even as Visigoths crossed the Danube, even as taxes went unpaid in the provinces, and generals declared themselves emperors far from Rome, citizens still visited their local Phalanca to drop off a tunic. The bureaucrats were gone, the marble was cracking, but the launderers remained. In this, we glimpse a fundamental truth of civilization. It is not the Senate or the general that keeps a city alive. It is the daily routine, the tradespeople, the low-born laborers who take your filth and return you dignity. The Christianization of laundry. As Rome shifted toward Christianity in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, attitudes toward bodily cleanliness changed. Ritual bathing declined. Simpler dress became more acceptable. But fullers adapted. Instead of bleaching togas for elite processions, they cleaned simple robes for monks and clergy. They serviced pilgrims, whose long journeys left their garments in need of care. Some fullers likely operated under the protection of new Christian patrons, their shops now blessed by St. Veronica or St. Zita, rather than Minerva or Hercules. The tools stayed the same, the processes stayed the same, only the language of respectability changed. Now it was not about whiteness for public display. It was about modesty, neatness, and spiritual discipline. But the job, still dirty, still essential, still looked down upon. The long decline. By the time Rome fell in 476 CE, the fullers had already been at work for nearly 600 years. The city's last emperors may have been powerless, but its fullers still maintained the only sort of power that lasts: reliable service. Eventually, as the aqueducts collapsed, trade routes withered, and currency devalued into irrelevance, even the fullers gave way. Their vats dried up, their treaded garments became rags. But the legacy of their industry of systematic, regulated, urban sanitation would re-emerge centuries later. Not in Rome, but in the textile guilds of medieval Europe, the wet processing houses of Islamic cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, the rise of professional laundresses in Paris and London, the invention of lye soap and bleach in the early modern period, and eventually in the coin-operated laundromat down the street from where you live now. The legacy of the P-tax. It's easy to laugh at Vespasian's urine tax, but what he did was foundational. He monetized waste in a sustainable, infrastructure-supporting way. That logic continues today. Wastewater treatment fees, garbage collection surcharges, environmental remediation taxes, public sanitation utility charges. What Vespasian proved was that no resource is too vile to regulate, and no regulation is too humble to support state power. And perhaps that's what made Rome so durable. It didn't pretend that it was above the mess. It simply said, if it smells, we can still make money from it. A quiet respect. The fullers received no monuments, no epic poems, no military triumphs. Their tools have crumbled, their names forgotten, but their function is everywhere around us. Every time you rinse a shirt in the sink, fold laundry with care, complain about detergent, buy bleach at the store, you are engaging with a legacy. They began the science and economy of cleanliness. They lived in an empire obsessed with cleanliness of appearance, and they made that possible quietly, repeatedly, despite the smell. Final reflection. There's a reason no fuller was ever made emperor. Their work was too essential to be honored, too close to the body, too mundane for glory. But civilization is not built on glory. It is built on repetition, routine, and resolve. And for 6 centuries, the Roman fullers scrubbed, stomped, rinsed, and bleached, transforming human waste into societal respectability. Their work was not beautiful, but it was what held the illusion of beauty together. Story 4. When monks invented the to-do list. A bell tolls in the dark. It is the early hours before dawn in a small stone monastery nestled in the hills of 6th century Gaul. The world outside is silent. Cold seeps through the walls, but inside, a bell rings not with urgency, but with intention. A figure stirs from a wooden cot, then another. Dozens of men dressed in coarse wool robes rise together. No words, no groans, they move in practiced silence. Their first task of the day, vigils the night prayer. They walk single file to the chapel, kneel, and begin to chant the psalms. In the flicker of oil lamps, time begins not according to the sun, but to the rule. And that rule is everything. This is a Benedictine monastery, and its guiding document, the Rule of Saint Benedict, is one of the most influential pieces of writing in Western history, not because it was poetic, but because it was practical. It was, in essence, a to-do list for an entire lifetime. The invention of monastic time. Before Saint Benedict, Christian ascetics wandered deserts, lived in caves, or formed loosely organized communities with varying levels of discipline. Their days were shaped by personal piety, not institutional structure. Benedict of Nursia changed that. Around 516 CE, Benedict wrote a rule, a concise manual outlining how monks should live, pray, eat, work, and rest, all in deliberate balance. It was not philosophical, it was administrative, and that was its genius. He divided the day into a regimented schedule of 8 prayer services, called the Divine Office, punctuating daily life with spiritual rhythm. These were Matins vigils, around 2-3 a.m. Lauds at dawn. Prime early morning. Terce mid-morning. Sext midday. None mid-afternoon. Vespers at sunset. Compline before bed. These weren't optional. They were the clockwork of monastic life. Between them, monks worked, studied, cooked, cleaned, gardened, or copied manuscripts, every task timed and tracked. In short, Benedict invented a human alarm system, centuries before mechanical clocks. His to-do list wasn't for one person. It was for an entire institution, self-sustaining and self-governing. The rule as operating system. The Rule of Saint Benedict is just 73 chapters long, many of them only a few sentences. But together, they form a code base for monastic life, touching on everything from mealtime procedures to how to punish a monk who interrupts reading aloud. Each monk had assigned tasks, rotated weekly. Reader at meals, kitchen porter, cellarer in charge of supplies, infirmarian caretaker of the sick, novice master trainer of newcomers. And each task came with clear expectations. Rise when the bell sounds. Do not speak in the cloister unless necessary. Be punctual to every hour of prayer. Clean your tools and return them to their place. Record inventory changes for the abbot to review. This wasn't spirituality in abstract. This was project management with spiritual intent. The rule did not tell monks how to feel. It told them what to do next. A life without surprises. In a Benedictine monastery, no moment was unaccounted for. This predictability wasn't oppressive, it was the point. Monks gave up personal freedom in exchange for a life of purposeful repetition. The to-do list, embedded in their rule, became a means of salvation. Even meals were scheduled down to the last bean. Lunch at sext, always preceded by psalm recitation. Dinner at vespers unless fasting. Bread ration adjusted by season and labor intensity. Wine permitted in moderation, but never more than a hemina, roughly 250 ml. Tasks weren't assigned once. They were logged, rotated, and reported. We know this because hundreds of medieval monastery logs survive, listing daily duties, inventories, and minor deviations. One even reads, Brother G failed to report for garden duty. assigned to kitchen next week as penance. Monasteries were not havens of vague holiness. They were early bureaucratic institutions, and the rule was their procedural manual. Monks as managers. One of the most surprising outcomes of the Benedictine system was how it trained administrators. In a world where literacy was rare and management skills were informal, monasteries became centers of competence. Young men, often of noble birth, were trained to schedule resources, distribute labor, track inventory, manage people, copy legal documents and correspondence. In some regions, abbots were more powerful than local lords precisely because they could run complex operations. They weren't just praying, they were organizing. One monastery might have 60 monks, 300 acres of farmland, 2 mills, 20 cows, 500 volumes in its library, 1 infirmary, 12 external staff, lay brothers, and 1 man. The abbot managed it all, using the rule as his guide. The bell as alarm. Before mechanical clocks, the bell regulated everything. Monasteries developed elaborate bell towers to signal the hours of prayer and work. Each bell had a name, a purpose, and a sound. The tones were so familiar that monks could wake from sleep and know the time based on tone and rhythm. Benedictine monasteries became the first institutions in Europe to divide the day with precision, marking it not by vague phases of sun, but by distinct, repeatable intervals. They made time measurable by sound. They made the day countable by duty. In essence, they transformed time into a flowchart, long before the word existed. Copy, repeat, endure. In their scriptoria, monks copied books, biblical texts, classical works, legal codes. But more often, they copied logs, inventories, and rules. This copying wasn't creativity. It was preservation through repetition. They believed that through perfect copying and routine, eternity could be glimpsed in the mundane. This is why the rule survived. It was copied, adapted, and implemented in thousands of monasteries over the next millennium. And with each new house, a new daily to-do list was born. Different region, same rhythm. Different generation, same duties. It was civilization by template. The quiet influence. When Charlemagne reformed education in the 8th century, he relied on monks trained under Benedictine discipline to establish schools, train clergy, and standardize Latin. Why? Because they could follow rules. They could document processes. They could teach schedules. Later, as medieval universities emerged, they borrowed monastic patterns. Lecture schedules, lesson planning, dormitory discipline, standardized meals and routines. Even the rise of office work in early modern Europe, from chancelleries to courts, was inspired by monastic models of organization. The punch card didn't invent routine, Benedict did. A question in the silence. We often praise innovation, flexibility, and freedom. But for over 1,000 years, the most successful institutions in Europe were based on repetition, predictability, and obedience to the list. And in the silence between bells, a monk would kneel in prayer, then rise, knowing exactly what came next, not because he was told, but because he already knew. So we must ask, in a world that celebrates spontaneity, is there still a kind of freedom in not having to decide what to do next? Ora et labora, pray and work. In the monasteries that followed the rule of Saint Benedict, the phrase ora et labora, pray and work, was not a motto to be recited. It was a logistical command to be followed hour by hour, season by season, decade by decade. There was no separation between the sacred and the routine. Prayer was not a retreat from duty, it framed it. Likewise, work was not simply toil, it was a form of devotion. This wasn't metaphorical. Monks believed that a task well executed, whether copying a manuscript, tilling a field, or feeding the hungry was as much an offering to God as any chant sung in the choir. And to do this, they relied not on spiritual ecstasy, but on a schedule. From hours to tasks. The daily schedule of a Benedictine monk was laid out with remarkable precision. Here, how a typical day might be structured in the 9th or 10th century. 2:30 a.m. wake for vigils matins, long psalms often sung in the dark, lasting over an hour. 4:00 a.m. return to rest briefly or begin private study. 6:00 a.m. lauds, followed by prime early morning prayers. 7:00 a.m. work begins, labor in fields, kitchens, or scriptoria. 9:00 a.m. terce, followed by continuation of assigned tasks. 12:00 p.m. sext and midday meal in silence, often accompanied by a reading monk. 1:00 p.m. short rest or meditation. 3:00 p.m. none, followed by more work or study. 5:00 p.m. vespers and the evening meal. 7:00 p.m. compline final prayer of the day. 8:00 p.m. sleep. No minute unspoken for, no hour without a task. But it wasn't merely a prison of prayer. It was a choreographed structure designed to shape the monk's inner and outer life into a harmonious order. Task rotation and accountability. One might assume such a schedule would breed monotony, and yet rotation was built into the system. Jobs were changed weekly or monthly. The refectorian oversaw dining and dishwashing. The kitchen master directed food prep and rationing. The porter managed the monastery gate and welcomed strangers. The cantor led the singing of psalms. Even the reader at meals rotated, giving each monk an opportunity to practice literacy and recitation. Tasks were assigned by the abbot or the prior, often based on skill, temperament, and seniority. But each assignment came with clear expectations, often written down or passed along orally with precision. And if a monk failed to fulfill his duty, he might be assigned additional chores. He could be removed from a rotation for retraining. In some cases, he might be denied speaking rights during meals, a minor but meaningful penance. There were no annual performance reviews. There were daily observations, quiet, watchful, communal. Monks were not measured by charisma, but by reliability. Labor as a path to balance. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized moderation above all. Too much prayer and one might become proud. Too much work and one might neglect the soul. Too much silence and one might turn bitter. So the rule created a system where each monk worked with his hands, prayed with his voice, listened with his heart, learned with his mind. Everything was scheduled in balance, not by accident but by careful design. In this way, the to-do list became more than logistical, it was spiritual therapy. To know what came next was to calm the mind. To perform that task faithfully was to discipline the body. To do both without complaint was to shape the soul. The scriptorium, time made visible. No task in the monastery combined spiritual purpose and task discipline more than the scriptorium, the writing room. Here, monks copied manuscripts letter by letter, line by line, in silence and stillness. The process was physically grueling. Pens were made from sharpened reeds or quills. Ink was mixed daily, gall ink from oak, soot for black, minerals for colors. Each manuscript took weeks or months to complete. Mistakes had to be scraped off with a knife or corrected in cramped marginalia. And yet these monks sat in wooden stalls, hunched over vellum, often in poor light, recording the entirety of Western knowledge. Their schedule was rigid. Begin copying at prime. Break for terce, return immediately. Stop at sex for food, resume for an hour or two. End at none, just in time for vespers. The scribe didn't set his own pace, the rule did. And because the to-do list was followed with such exactitude, we now possess thousands of surviving manuscripts that shape the course of human learning. Without these monks and their sacred scheduling, most ancient texts would be lost. Reading the margins of routine. If you look closely at some medieval manuscripts, you find glimpses of fatigue. The ink is thin, the day is long. Thank God this page is done. Let the reader be merciful to the copier. These aren't confessions. They're routine observations, slight, human cracks in an otherwise solid wall of repetition. They reveal that even in this highly regimented life, monks were conscious of their task as labor, not just piety. But they also kept going. Because it wasn't about inspiration, it was about faithfulness to the next task. And the rule gave them that faithfulness in list form. Monastic scheduling beyond the cloister. As monasteries grew in number and complexity, their internal scheduling began to shape entire communities. Villagers came to expect the bell for prayer heard across the fields, the weekly market timed to the monastic calendar, the feast days regulated by monastic preparation, the distribution of alms occurring at the same hour each week. Local laypeople oriented their lives around monastic time. And when monasteries ran schools, hospitals, or guest houses, those too followed the internal rhythm of the rule. Time, once the domain of sun and stars, became structured by bells and bodies trained to move in rhythm, day after day. The list that survived the plague. In the 14th century, as the Black Death tore through Europe, monasteries were not spared. In some regions, up to 2/3 of the monastic population died. Yet many communities continued. Why? Because the rule persisted. The schedule outlived the individual. New monks were trained in the same routines. Daily prayer resumed even after mass burials. Tasks were reassigned, often doubled, but the to-do list held. Scriptoria reopened, and chronicles of the plague were recorded in the same hand as the Psalms. It is one of the quiet miracles of the Middle Ages. Routine endured where reason and hope sometimes faltered. And all because of a list that said, "Do this now, then do this next." A question in the margin. In our world of productivity hacks and motivational posters, we often chase novelty and optimization. But monks, 1,500 years ago, chose sameness. They followed the same schedule every day, not because it was efficient, but because it was anchoring. And so we ask, is a list only useful when it helps us do more? Or is it sacred when it simply tells us what matters most, one step at a time? A rule that became a system. When Saint Benedict wrote his rule in the 6th century, he did not intend to change the world. He intended only to bring order to a small group of men seeking a life of spiritual discipline in chaotic times. But what he produced was more than a devotional guide. It was a template for institutional structure, a framework that allowed a group of people to organize time, task, hierarchy, and purpose without constant oversight. Over the next 1,000 years, that rule spread first across Italy, then into Gaul, Iberia, Britannia, and beyond. By the 9th century, under Charlemagne, it became the standard monastic rule for the Frankish Empire. And as it spread, it shaped more than monasteries. It began to influence the secular world quietly, methodically, and always through its lists. Beyond the monastery walls, the rule of Saint Benedict never commanded armies, passed laws, or seized territory, yet it informed how schools were scheduled, how hospitals were staffed, how land was managed and recorded, how food stores were inventoried, how workers were rotated through duties. In many ways, it was the first managerial playbook of the Middle Ages. When royal courts began building bureaucracies in the 11th and 12th centuries, they didn't model them on merchant guilds or peasant villages. They looked to monasteries. Monks had shown that a self-contained institution could run farms and mills, maintain financial records, train new generations in a standard format, preserve and reproduce texts, balance labor with reflection. And all of this was possible because of a systematized list, an articulated schedule that worked even when individuals failed. From monks to managers, by the 13th century, the ideas of task rotation, duty logs, and scheduled labor had made their way into cathedral schools, law offices, and universities. Take Oxford University in the 1200s. Its academic calendar mirrored the liturgical year used in monasteries. Chapel attendance and meals were strictly scheduled. Faculty roles rotated annually. Students followed daily timetables for lectures, meals, and rest. It was a monastic rhythm reinterpreted for scholarship. Later, as towns grew and merchant guilds developed, they too adopted list-driven organization. Apprentice rotations, ledger systems, shared responsibility charts. But they didn't invent these systems, they inherited them. And behind it all, often silently, was the Benedictine example. Time itself was transformed. Perhaps the most profound effect of the monastic list was how it changed the way humans perceived time. In the Roman world, time was measured by the sun, the stars, and major public events. It was relative. In the monastic world, time became segmentable, repeatable, measurable. And so, bells replaced sundials, chants replaced festivals, work hours replaced wandering. Even without clocks, monks divided the day into equal parts called canonical hours, not by precision, but by commitment to structure. They believed that repetition sanctified time, and that philosophy bled outward, eventually influencing mechanical clockmakers of the 14th century, who built devices to mark prayer hours, town councils, who scheduled public duties and guard rotations using monastic-style logs, factories centuries later that adopted fixed-hour shifts. Benedict's rule did not just give structure to prayer, it made time itself administrative. Writing as ritual. The monks who followed the rule didn't just follow schedules, they documented them. Many monasteries maintained customaries, handwritten books that outlined how the rule was applied locally. These included duty rosters, food inventories, guesthouse logs, scriptorium assignments, weather observations important for farming. These lists weren't simply bureaucratic, they were considered sacred tools. A well-kept logbook wasn't just useful, it was proof of obedience. And in a world where chaos was common, raids, famine, illness, these simple logs often outlasted their keepers. Modern historians reconstruct entire centuries of rural European life through these lists, not grand chronicles, but mundane records of who fed the chickens on Thursday. The boredom that built a civilization. The monk's life was, by modern standards, unbearably repetitive. The same prayers, the same meals, the same chores, the same chants, the same script copied again and again. But this was the point. Where the outside world prized excitement, monasteries chose consistency. Where society followed kings and wars, monks followed routine. And while empires rose and fell, their walls held, their rules endured, their checklists survived. We often imagine history as shaped by drama, but it was also shaped by discipline, quiet, enduring, scheduled. A legacy in every calendar. Today, we don't think of our digital calendars, daily planners, or workplace routines as spiritual inheritances. But they are. The to-do list you scribble on Monday morning. The prioritization of tasks. The segmentation of work into hours. The rotating of duties across a team. The subtle comfort in checking something off. All of these stem, in part, from monks who couldn't decide their schedule because their schedule was their salvation. Even the modern workweek bears echoes of monastic structure. Benedict divided time into labor, rest, and reflection, the same three categories many wellness guides promote today. The monks weren't optimizing for efficiency. They were optimizing for order. And in doing so, they modeled a civilization. The final bell. As the day came to an end in monasteries across Europe, the bell rang for Compline, the final prayer. Monks extinguished their lamps, washed their hands, and retired in silence. They didn't ask what they would do tomorrow. They already knew. And they would do it not because they felt inspired or pressured, but because it was next on the list. One step closer to devotion. One step closer to order. One step closer to understanding a universe they believed had been created not chaotically, but with intentional sequence. Final reflection. In an age of constant distraction, algorithmic interruption, and motivational slogans about breaking routines, we might ask, what if the secret to enduring peace is not in doing more, but in simply doing what comes next faithfully and without fanfare? For the monks who invented the to-do list, this was not just productivity. It was purpose. Story 5. The medieval toll booth that funded a kingdom. The forgotten foundations of sovereignty. When we imagine how medieval kingdoms built their fortunes, we often think of plunder, tribute, or war spoils. Perhaps we envision the glitter of a royal treasury or the taxes collected from peasants trudging to a manor. But wealth in the Middle Ages often came from something far more mundane: a narrow bridge, a checkpoint on a dusty road, or a stone gatehouse by a river. Not a fortress, not a bank, but a toll booth. In the 11th to 14th centuries, as European kingdoms grew and trade networks revived after centuries of instability, a new kind of infrastructure emerged. The institutionalized toll station, quiet, fortified, and quietly profitable. And these weren't merely nuisances or medieval speed traps. They became pillars of state finance. In some cases, entire kingdoms depended on them. This is the story of how the right to pass through became one of the most lucrative and quietly transformative powers a ruler could hold. What exactly was a toll? In the medieval world, a toll was not merely a payment, it was a legal rite of passage enforced by force and custom. Tolls could be charged for crossing a bridge, passing a city gate, using a public road, transporting goods across a river, accessing a mountain pass, setting up at a marketplace. Each toll had its own rate, usually based on the value or weight of goods, and recorded in a document known as a toll schedule. Rates might include 1 denier per cartload of grain, 3 deniers for wool bales, a fixed toll for herds of livestock, discounts for locals or guild members, higher rates for foreigners. The logic was simple: you're using infrastructure built or protected by someone else. Pay for the privilege. From robbery to regulation. In earlier centuries, particularly during the chaotic post-Roman period, such tolls were often extracted through force, without consent or record. These were nothing more than roadside robberies by local warlords or opportunistic bandits. But as feudal authority stabilized and kings sought to centralize power, tolls became codified, regulated, and enforced by charter. Royal toll stations were different. They were often manned by official tollkeepers. They issued receipts. They maintained ledgers of passing merchants. They sometimes even provided guarded caravans or escorts. The toll, in short, became a contract, money in exchange for safe, predictable movement. This shift from arbitrary extortion to recognized payment marked a key transformation in the idea of sovereignty itself. A case study: the Rhine River tolls. Perhaps the most famous, and most lucrative of medieval tolls were found along the Rhine River in what is now modern Germany. The Rhine was the commercial spine of the Holy Roman Empire. Stretching from Switzerland to the North Sea, it carried everything from salt and wine, timber and iron, spices from the Levant, cloth from Flanders, furs from the Baltic. Control a section of the Rhine, and you could grow rich without lifting a sword. And so, kings, bishops and barons erected toll castles at narrow points along the river. Rainfall's Castle, Pfalzgrafenstein, a tiny island castle that functioned entirely as a toll booth. Marksburg, Ehrenfels. These were not military outposts, they were profit engines. They used signal fires to flag ships. If a merchant didn't stop, chains stretched across the river could be raised to block them. Resistance could lead to confiscation or worse. Toll farming, delegating the greed. But kings didn't want to manage tolls directly. It was tedious, bureaucratic work. Instead, they sold or leased toll rights to private individuals, nobles, churchmen, or wealthy merchants in exchange for lump sums or annual payments. This was called toll farming. Here how it worked. The monarch grants a toll franchise for a fixed term, say 5 years. The toll farmer pays a fee up front or agrees to share profits. The toll farmer hires his own collectors, builds infrastructure, and enforces payments. Anything collected beyond the agreed amount is his to keep. Naturally, this system led to overcharging, corruption, and negotiated abuse. But it also brought regular income to the crown and incentivized the development of toll infrastructure. Some toll farmers became extraordinarily wealthy, powerful enough to influence regional politics or fund entire mercantile ventures. Cities that bought their freedom. As towns and cities grew richer from trade, they began to chafe under royal tolls, especially when their merchants were being charged at every step of a journey. The solution: buy the toll rights. Several cities negotiated charters with their kings to collect tolls themselves, using the revenue for city walls and fortifications, public wells and markets, road repair and sanitation, local militia funding. This move, buying toll rights, was a key step toward urban autonomy in Europe. A merchant city was no longer merely a subject of the crown. It became a co-governing economic entity with vested interests in infrastructure and trade protection. The toll booth as surveillance. Beyond money, toll stations became vital points of information gathering. Collectors maintained manifests of passing goods, origin and destination of shipments, lists of ship captains or caravan leaders, counts of livestock, carts and barrels. This made toll station the bureaucratic nerve centers of early kingdoms. A clever monarch could use toll data to predict shortages or surpluses, track merchant loyalties, monitor foreign movement, impose targeted embargoes. The humble toll booth became a window into the economy, and that made it invaluable. A system with consequences. While tolls funded roads, bridges, castles, and crowns, they also slowed trade when overused, encouraged smuggling through forest paths, incited peasant unrest when locals were overcharged, triggered wars when foreign merchants were harassed. In the 13th century, the Rhenish League of Cities was formed partly in protest of excessive river tolls. Merchants united to demand fairer rates or bypass the Rhine entirely. Eventually, some toll stations were destroyed by angry traders. Others were reabsorbed by the crown and re-regulated. And yet, even at their worst, tolls were preferable to chaos. A predictable fee was better than arbitrary confiscation. A ledger was better than a sword. A pause before the boom. By the dawn of the 14th century, European kingdoms stood on the edge of transformation. Trade was accelerating. Cities were growing. Monarchs were consolidating power. And much of this was funded not by conquest, but by checkpoints, by tolls paid at stone arches, river crossings, and winding roads through alpine passes. Toll booths may seem boring, but they funded wars, cathedrals, universities, whole cities. They were boring, yes, but they were essential. A final tollkeeper's thought. As a merchant caravan approaches a toll gate at dusk, carts creaking, oxen weary, documents ready, you might wonder, who really owns the road? Is it the king whose name is on the sign? The tollkeeper who holds the keys? The merchant who paid to pave it? Or the kingdom that survives because someone stopped, counted, and paid before passing through? Counting coins, building crowns. To the average merchant in the 13th century, a toll might seem like a nuisance, a handful of coins dropped into the outstretched hand of a gatekeeper, a signature in a ledger, perhaps a grumble under one's breath. But to kings and princes, tolls were something altogether different. Predictable revenue, the golden drip that financed courts, armies, and diplomacy. Unlike taxes levied through feudal obligations, which were often collected in kind, sporadically, and with resentment, tolls offered something better. Cash, continuity, control. With each passing cart, each barge of wine, each string of pack horses bearing wool or salt or spices, a realm grew richer in coin, and that coin funded power itself. The king's ledger, revenue in the round. Let's take a closer look at what toll revenue might look like for a medieval kingdom. Consider the Plantagenet monarchs of 12th and 13th century England. While much of their income came from land rents and feudal dues, trade tolls and passage fees provided an increasingly crucial stream of hard coin. Records show tolls collected on bridges like London Bridge, which doubled as a fortress and market; river ports such as Southampton, where incoming wine and cloth were weighed and taxed; rural highways where toll gates were manned by royal agents or leased out to local barons. Estimates suggest that in high trade years, up to 20% of a crown's liquid revenue could come from tolls, customs duties, and market fees, enough to fund months of military campaigns or years of administrative salary. And these figures don't include the shadow benefits. Intelligence gathered, merchant loyalty maintained, road security ensured. A toll wasn't just a payment, it was a transaction of sovereignty. The toll and the state, bureaucracy emerges. Tolls weren't just profitable, they were administratively revolutionary. To manage tolls effectively, monarchs began developing centralized ledgers, accounting scrolls that tracked income from dozens of gates and ports; standard weights and measures, ensuring a bale of cloth was the same in Norwich as it was in Bordeaux; regional inspectors, tasked with visiting toll sites, auditing receipts, and rooting out fraud; legal frameworks, to define who owed tolls, how much, and under what exemptions. In short, toll collection forced kingdoms to build early bureaucracies. Many of the institutions that would evolve into ministries of finance, chambers of commerce, or departments of customs began as humble offices managing toll revenues and disputes. This was governance born of gatekeeping, literally. Merchants, passports, and toll privileges. While tolls might have slowed movement, they also created a new category of people: protected merchants. Through the granting of toll privileges, kings encouraged trade by issuing merchant charters that guaranteed safe passage and fair toll rates, offering passport documents or letters of protection to foreign traders entering royal markets, exempting guilds or cities from certain fees to reward loyalty or encourage settlement. This had a powerful side effect. It formalized the rights of merchants under law. Instead of wandering opportunists, Traders became recognized agents of the economy, with papers, protections, and even recourse to royal courts. Some of the earliest concepts of economic citizenship and merchant rights trace back to toll statutes in cities like Bruges, Lubeck, and York. In this way, the toll booth did not just collect coin, it defined who belonged and who had the right to move. The toll as diplomacy, crossing borders. Because tolls were charged at borders, they naturally became tools of diplomacy and dispute. A prince might raise tolls on foreign merchants to pressure their king during negotiations, retaliate for raids or economic sabotage, favor domestic traders. Conversely, toll exemptions were often part of peace treaties, trading agreements, or royal marriages. A dowry might include not just gold, but freedom from tolls in all lands of my husband's realm. One 13th century treaty between England and Flanders specifically guaranteed Flemish weavers free passage through English toll gates during times of peace. And as toll laws became entangled with diplomacy, they required international oversight, early glimpses of cross-border economic regulation. Toll disputes and medieval justice. What happened when a toll was contested? Was the tollkeeper overcharging? Was a trader exempt under an old charter? Had the wrong goods been listed in the ledger? In these cases, appeals could be made to royal courts, and remarkably, many records of such disputes survive. These medieval lawsuits reveal a surprisingly complex legal culture. Toll rates were often codified in writing and required documentation. Disputes were judged based on precedent, custom, and the exact wording of privileges. Witnesses, including local clergy or scribes, might be called to verify long-standing exemptions. In essence, toll collection became one of the earliest arenas of economic law in medieval Europe. Not only were goods and money moving, so were ideas about rights, contracts, and fairness. When tolling went too far, of course, the system was not without abuse. In some parts of Europe, especially along the Rhine, toll inflation became so extreme that merchants paid more in fees than they earned in profit. Some petty lords, desperate for coin, established illegal toll stations built without royal sanction, enforced with private militia, and condemned by the church. These were called Robritter or robber barons, a term still used today. The response: in 1254, merchants and cities along the Rhine formed the Rheinischer Städtebund, Rhenish League of Cities, a coalition that hired its own militias to destroy illegal toll castles and protect lawful trade. It was a rare moment when traders took up arms not for conquest, but for the right to pass freely. In this way, tolls became a crucible for the idea that trade deserved protection not just from thieves, but from tyranny. The toll as an economic technology. By the late Middle Ages, toll collection had become so organized, it began to function like a primitive software system. Inputs: goods, merchants, carts, animals. Processing: rules, based on toll charts, exemptions, weather conditions, weight. Outputs: coin collected, receipts issued, ledgers updated. Monarchs used toll records to project economic forecasts. Toll farmers optimized routes for maximum yield. Cities negotiated complex multi-gate system to avoid bottlenecks. And every change in toll law sent ripples through market patterns, trade routes, and even migration flows. It was, in every sense, a logistical engine powered not by gears, but by handwriting, custom, and coin. A road paved in coin. If you traveled across Europe in the year 1300, you might stop at 24 toll stations between Genoa and Ghent. You pay coin after coin, hand over document after document, get your cart weighed, your goods inspected, and your bags stamped. And while this might seem like a gauntlet of bureaucracy, it also meant the roads were patrolled, the bridges were maintained, the laws were consistent, The realm, for all its flaws, was functioning, not by virtue of royal charisma, but because someone, somewhere, collected a toll, counted it, and wrote it down. A tollkeeper's dilemma. Standing in his wooden booth, ledger open, pen in hand, a tollkeeper sees the long caravan approaching. Silk and silver, bread and beer, wheels grinding on stone. He turns to his chart, counts the barrels, inspects the permits. He is not a knight or a priest or a king. But for that moment, he is the boundary between realms. And he wonders, is the kingdom built by the sword, or by those who quietly say, "Stop here, pay what is owed, then continue on your way"? The toll booth's twilight. By the 15th century, the quiet clink of coins in the toll collector's bowl was slowly being drowned out by the clatter of change. The medieval world, rooted in custom, privilege, and local dominion, was giving way to a new age of centralization, commerce, and mobility. And with that shift came a subtle but significant question. Was the toll booth still necessary? For centuries, the toll had been the heartbeat of infrastructure. It had kept roads safe, funded kings, and marked borders. But now merchants, cities, and even monarchs themselves were beginning to look beyond the gatehouse. And many of those once proud structures, bristling with ledgers, chains, and banners, were left to quiet decay. The printing press and the open road. One of the first signs of decline came with an invention far removed from the toll booth: the printing press. With the spread of printing in the late 15th century, information, especially commercial information, became far easier to replicate and distribute. Merchants no longer needed toll stations to verify routes or receive local trading laws. They could now consult printed tariff charts, maps, and merchant manuals in their own towns. This reduced the informational authority of tollkeepers. If you knew in advance what should be charged, you were less likely to overpay or submit quietly to abuse. And as printed exemptions, charters, and merchant privileges spread across Europe, traders began to push back more confidently and with documentation in hand. What was once accepted as just the way things are was now up for legal contest, review, and negotiation. The rise of free trade ideals. Simultaneously, an ideological shift was beginning to stir. In ports like Venice, Antwerp, and Lubeck, the idea of free trade was gaining popularity not just as an economic good, but as a moral and civic virtue. Why, they asked, should prosperity be hindered by 100 local tolls, each manned by someone with a rusty ledger and a rusty sword? Guilds began to argue that tolls restricted innovation, slowed movement, and created inefficiencies that hurt everyone, nobles and peasants alike. And so, by the 16th century, many powerful merchant cities started lobbying for toll abolition. Some simply bought out their toll rights permanently. Others appealed directly to kings, arguing that direct royal taxation would be more efficient and less corrupt. The toll booth, once a symbol of economic stewardship, was increasingly viewed as a drag on progress. From tolls to taxes. The real nail in the coffin, however, came from a surprising place: monarchs themselves. Whereas tolls had once been an essential tool of royal finance, they were now seen as unpredictable, especially in times of war or famine, easily manipulated by corrupt collectors, resented by merchants and towns. Rulers like Louis XI of France and Henry VII of England began to focus instead on centralized taxation, broad-based levies on land, income, or sales, collected by salaried officials rather than toll farmers. This shift reduced dependence on tolls, increased overall revenue, reduced resistance from growing merchant classes. In other words, kings had outgrown the toll booth. They were building modern states, and that meant modern finance. The tollkeepers forgotten. As the 1600s unfolded, toll booths across Europe were slowly decommissioned. Some were torn down, their stones repurposed for bridges or walls. Others were converted into homes, barns, or inns. A few remained as ceremonial arches, empty symbols of former checkpoints. In many cases, tollkeepers were dismissed with little ceremony. Their ledgers, once reviewed by kings and courts, were tossed into storage or lost to damp and dust. A role once seen as powerful and feared became something almost pitiable. The old question, who owns the road, had a new answer. The state does, and it trusts you to walk it. But not everywhere. It's worth noting that not all tolls vanished. In places where infrastructure remained under local control, like small mountain passes or isolated ferry crossings, tolls persisted for centuries. Even today, echoes remain. Modern highway tolls on turnpikes and bridges, customs duties at border crossings, usage fees for ports, canals, and tunnels. These are not medieval in their function. They are technological descendants, digitized and streamlined. But their DNA is unmistakable. Wherever someone says, "To go farther you must pay," the tollkeeper's legacy survives. What the toll booth left behind. Although most tolls faded, their legacy restructured civilization. Professionalized record-keeping. Toll ledgers helped train a generation of clerks, scribes, and accountants. Codified economic law. Toll disputes laid foundations for modern commercial jurisprudence. Connected distant regions. By regulating and documenting movement, tolls helped integrate fragmented territories. Monetized public infrastructure. Tolls were an early recognition that roads, bridges, and crossings had value and needed funding. And perhaps most importantly, tolls taught kingdoms the principle that every passage has a price, and that price can be measured, negotiated, and used to build something greater. A modern tollkeeper's reflection. Imagine, for a moment, the last tollkeeper standing at his wooden booth as the new king's men arrive to decommission the station. He watches as his chain is lowered one final time, the ledger closed, the bench cleared. No one applauds, no one thanks him. The merchants pass by, free now, nodding politely perhaps. The world moves on. But in that moment he might think, they built a kingdom behind this gate. They crossed oceans with the coin I counted. They moved armies with the roads I guarded. No sword, no sermon, no crown ever stood so long, so quiet, so dull. And yet so necessary. Final reflection. Tolls are boring. No child dreams of manning a booth. No hero's ballad begins. He checked the invoice and it was correct. But the truth is that power is often held by those who measure, count, and collect. The medieval toll booth was one of the first places where economics, law, sovereignty, and society all converged quietly, efficiently, and unglamorously. And while most have vanished, they remind us that even the most ordinary gate can shape the extraordinary story of a kingdom. Story 6. The Timekeeping Towers of Forgotten Villages. A bell for everyone and no one. Long before wristwatches, smartphones, or even reliable pocket sundials, there was the village bell. It did not tell time in minutes or seconds. It told time in moments. When to wake, when to pray, when to work, when to rest. And though no villager owned the bell, it belonged to all of them. It rang not for individuals, but for the community as a whole. And with each toll, a strange, beautiful idea emerged. Time was no longer a private thing. Time was shared, public, rhythmic, ordered by sound, not sight. The earliest village clock towers weren't really about precision. They were about presence, a way to tether people's days to something larger than themselves. And in many cases, they were the first public infrastructure ever built in a settlement. The world before clocks. To understand why the arrival of timekeeping towers mattered, we have to consider what came before. In the early medieval period, daily time was mostly relative, tied to the sun's position, not a standard hour. Local, based on natural cues, roosters crowing, shadows stretching. Flexible, labor started when it was light and ended when it was. Even religious time, such as the canonical hours for monks, varied slightly by region and season. Most people didn't need to know what hour it was, only what to do next. So when the first mechanical clocks emerged in the 13th century, they didn't change private lives immediately. But then came the towers. When towers began to tick. By the 1300s, cities like Milan, Padua, and Norwich began installing public mechanical clocks often mounted in towers, bell turrets, or high stone churches. These early clocks had no faces. They were purely auditory. They rang the hour, often by striking a bell once per hour count, 3 chimes for 3 o'clock, etc. Why bells? Because most people couldn't read, and because even those who could might not see a clock face from a distance. But sound, that traveled. It told time across rooftops, across vineyards, across village greens. A tower clock turned an abstract idea, the passing of time, into something physical, communal, and inescapable. From monastery to marketplace, the earliest tower clocks were funded by monasteries, who needed to keep canonical hours without relying on variable sundials. Cathedrals, who wanted to call the faithful to prayer with predictable rhythm. Guilds, who saw value in organizing labor and market hours precisely. And then came town councils. As towns grew in wealth and complexity, they needed to schedule markets, enforce curfews, regulate work hours, open and close gates at predictable times. A central timekeeper, a tower in the main square, made this possible. And thus, a quiet revolution began. Time becomes visible. By the late 1300s, some towers added faces to their clocks, wooden or iron dials with rotating hands, visible to those nearby. Still, most villagers relied on the sound. Bells became symbols of civic pride. Wealthy towns competed to install larger, more ornate bells. Some even had named bells, blessed by clergy and cast with inscriptions. The tolling of the bell wasn't just practical, it was ceremonial. A bell might chime the hour, then toll again for the Angelus. It might ring differently for feast days, weddings, or funerals. A triple ring might signal danger, fire, flood, or enemy sighted. And every villager, even if illiterate and landless, could understand the message. Time was no longer natural, it was curated, man-made, measured. Regulating the day, a quiet discipline. The presence of a clock tower had subtle but profound effects on behavior. Work hours became regularized. Laborers began their day with the morning bell and ended with the evening chime. This standardized wages, schedules, and productivity even without contracts. Punctuality became a value. Being on time went from vague to precise. Meetings, sermons, and markets all adhered to the hour. Late arrivals were noticed. Discipline emerged not from law but from the bell. Community synchronicity increased. Farmers and merchants, priests and guards, all lived by the same clock. It fostered a shared rhythm, even among people who never spoke to each other. In essence, the clock tower acted as a heartbeat for the town, audible proof that life was orderly, knowable, and ongoing. The sound of authority. It's important to note that tower clocks also served power. Who controlled the clock? Usually the church or town council. Sometimes, a guild would sponsor it and take pride in regulating its upkeep. And so, time became a form of soft control. The bell could enforce a curfew. It could signal when the market must close. It could wake people or send them to bed. In some cities, the penalty for ignoring bell orders was severe fines, public shamming, even corporal punishment. Time had become rule, and the clock tower was its voice. The clock keeper's life. Every tower had someone responsible for winding, tuning, and maintaining the mechanism. This was the clock keeper, a role of quiet importance. He lived often in the tower itself or nearby, tending the weights and counterweights, the gear teeth, the chime hammers, the bell ropes. Each morning and night, he climbed the narrow stairs, adjusted the pendulum in later centuries, and listened for alignment. He was one of the few who knew how the time was made, not just when it struck. And he knew, perhaps better than anyone, that keeping time was endless work. Time for the forgotten. Not every village had a clock tower, of course. But even in the smallest hamlets, a single bell hanging from a wooden beam, a tree, or a chapel could serve a similar function. Some villages pooled funds to install miniature clocks. Others relied on traveling bellmen. Still others set time by echo, waiting for the faint sound of the city's bell, carried by wind across the fields. It was imprecise, but it reminded people someone somewhere was keeping the time. A question in the silence. Eventually, more precise personal timepieces would make the tower clock redundant. Pocket watches, pendulum clocks, railway timetables, atomic seconds. But something changed when time went private. It stopped being shared. And in that loss of shared rhythm, we might wonder, what did we leave behind? When the bell rang for us all, and we listened together. A day in the life of a village marked by bells. In the shadow of the clock tower, life unfolded not in hours and minutes, but in tones and intervals. While today we glance at numbers glowing on screens or ticking on wrists, the people of late medieval and early Renaissance Europe lived by a more auditory order. Imagine you are a villager in a 15th century German town. The day begins not with sunlight through a window, but with a low, single peal of the morning bell known as the lauds. It's a gentle call to rise. Bakers stir in the pre-dawn dark. Carpenters gather tools. Even the church bells, in their musical authority, seem to murmur, "Begin." By midday, the bell rings again 3 times, slow and clear. This is the Angelus, a call to pause, reflect, and mark the midpoint of the labor day. In many towns, work tools are dropped in unison. A moment of stillness overtakes workshops, fields, and even marketplaces. Later, the evening bell or compline marks the day's close. Children are gathered from streets. Markets are shuttered. Curfews are anticipated. The bell not only structures time, it defines what kind of time it is. Bell variations and their meanings. Clock tower bells were not monotonous. Their chimes varied in tone, pattern, and meaning, creating a language of sound understood by the whole village. Single peal often signaled the hour. Triple chime marked religious observance or announcements. Rapid, urgent tolling, fire, attack, or natural disaster. Solemn, slow tolls, a death in the community. Joyous ringing, carillons, festivals, weddings, or coronations. Some bells were tuned differently, allowing distinct towers to be recognized across the landscape. A traveler could tell where he was even in fog or dark by sound alone. When time became taxed, the increasing regularity brought by clock towers enabled governments and guilds to do something previously difficult: measure labor. With a shared, audible time standard, cities could enforce standard workdays, sunrise to 7th bell. Pay wages by the hour, not by output or vague durations. Open and close markets with strict timekeeping. Penalize lateness or early departure from civic duties. In some towns, bells signaled the beginning and end of guild labor, and being out of place during those hours, particularly if one was supposed to be working, could result in fines. Thus, the bell became an instrument of economic discipline, transforming labor into something measurable, taxable, and regimented. The timekeeper as power broker. Clockkeepers held more influence than most remember. Not only did they maintain the tower's gears, they decided when the bell should ring, how long it should chime, what sounds corresponded to which events. Some were even paid extra to ring bells for royal decrees, civic celebrations, military warnings. Their job was both mechanical and symbolic, part technician, part town crier. A few were corruptible. There are documented cases where bellkeepers delayed time ringing later in the morning, giving favored guilds more working hours, or chiming prematurely to cut competitors' days short. In response, city councils created regulations for bell accuracy, including surprise inspections and standardized candle clocks used to cross-check time. The stakes were high. When time became official, its manipulation became a crime. Sound wars, competing clocks and clashing bells. In growing towns with multiple parishes or power centers, disputes arose over who controlled the dominant time. Should the town hall or the cathedral set the hour? Should monastic prayer times override merchant schedules? Which bell had final authority? These rivalries sometimes led to bell conflicts, not physical violence, but sonic battles. For instance, two towers ringing at slightly different times would confuse the population. A political faction might install its own clock to assert control. In one French town, a newly built guild hall rang a larger, louder bell than the cathedral, sparking a civic quarrel that lasted a decade. Eventually, many cities issued ordinances declaring a master clock, often housed in the central civic tower, and deemed the legal time for contracts, markets, and public order. This marked a turning point. Civic time over religious time, a subtle shift of authority from church to state. Bells and the birth of scheduling. With fixed public time, towns began to schedule everything. Public meetings and court sessions, religious processions, market toll inspections, night patrol changes, execution times. This scheduling brought a new layer of predictability to urban life. In earlier centuries, events happened when everyone arrived. Now they happened when the bell struck. Time was becoming not just something to be followed, but something to be planned. This transition was foundational to the development of modern administration, commerce, and urban management. Bell maintenance and community effort. Maintaining a clock tower was no simple task. Wooden gears swelled and shrank with the weather. Weights had to be hoisted daily, sometimes by hand. Bell ropes frayed and wore down quickly. Dust, moisture, and rats could damage the mechanisms. Some towns appointed teams of clock boys or bell apprentices to support the master clockkeeper. Others held annual bell cleaning festivals, where volunteers helped clean the tower and re-gild inscriptions. In some regions, villagers contributed grain or coin to maintain the bell, believing it spiritually protected the town. Indeed, in folk tradition, bells weren't just timekeepers, they were guardian voices, whose ringing could drive away storms, demons, or misfortune. Gender and the sound of time. It's worth noting, clockkeeping was almost exclusively a male profession, but women were profoundly affected by its rhythms. Washing had to be done before the midday bell. Alewives, women who brewed beer, timed boiling and cooling using bell intervals. Churching, a post-childbirth purification rite, was often scheduled by bell time. In effect, while men built and ran the towers, women lived within their soundscapes, organizing complex domestic lives around them. Few wrote diaries about it, but the invisible labor of women was just as ordered by the bell as the visible labor of tradesmen. The bell tower as social center. Clock towers also served as communal spaces, places where townspeople gathered to read proclamations posted below, hear news shouted from balconies, watch parades begin or end, find shelter during storms. Many towers had public platforms, used for speeches or seasonal festivities. And in some villages, Young couples carved initials into the wooden stair rails of the tower, a local tradition of marking passing love within measured time. The tower was not only the keeper of time, it was witness to it. The question that remains: as the 17th century neared, the rise of domestic clocks, watches, and portable timepieces began to decentralize the clock tower's authority. Time slowly became personal. But something was lost in that transition, a kind of unified rhythm, a communal heartbeat shared by every soul within earshot. And so we're left with a simple question. When the bell no longer told us what time it was, did we forget how to listen together? The great turning inward. By the dawn of the 17th century, something profound began to happen across European towns and cities. Time, once public and collective, began to go private. Where once the toll of the bell had unified a town's rhythm, calling the faithful to prayer, the worker to labor, the child to school, now, increasingly, people began to carry time with them. The invention and refinement of domestic clocks and personal timepieces didn't just make timekeeping more convenient. It changed the social contract around time entirely. A villager no longer needed to wait for the bell tower to strike noon to know when to eat. A merchant could now measure labor with far greater precision, and in some cases, with no need for the clock tower at all. And gradually, the once pivotal timekeeping towers, those proud stone sentinels of rhythm and order, began to fall into quiet neglect. The rise of the household clock. The proliferation of domestic clocks in the 1600s can be attributed to several key developments. Spring mechanisms. Unlike older weight-driven models, new clocks could be compacted into cases and placed on shelves, mantels, or desks. Pendulum accuracy. The invention of the pendulum clock by Christian Huygens in 1656 drastically improved accuracy down to seconds per day. Mass production techniques. In regions like the Black Forest of Germany, cottage industries began to produce clocks in large quantities, making them affordable even to middle-class households. By 1700, it was not uncommon for a village shopkeeper or a well-off farmer to own a bracket clock, or a small, portable timepiece. The auditory monopoly of the bell tower was broken. Now, time whispered from wooden cases in kitchens and parlors, not just from steeples and squares. When bells faded into background, as clocks spread, their cultural role shifted. The bell became nostalgic, a comforting reminder of communal order, but no longer the sole source of temporal truth. Younger generations relied more on their own clocks, tuning out the bells except during festivals or emergencies. Towns began to ring fewer hours, sometimes only at dawn, noon, and dusk if at all. In places where the clock tower had once tolled every quarter hour, silence slowly crept in. And with that silence, something else faded too: the shared structure of time. Disputes over timekeeping. Ironically, as individual clocks grew more precise, disagreements about time increased. One family's clock might run fast by 5 minutes. A shopkeeper might claim his timepiece was more accurate than the church bell. Travelers moving between towns often found time off by as much as 20-30 minutes. In an age without time zones, every village still kept its own local solar time, meaning noon was simply when the sun was at its highest. But now people were comparing time with neighbors, merchants, and distant cities. The very individualization of time revealed its instability. In a strange twist, the old bell tower, imprecise as it was, had offered something clocks could not: unified time. The clock tower's last functions. By the 18th century, most village clock towers retained only a few roles. Ceremony. Bells were still rung for weddings, deaths, and feast days. Emergency signal. The tower bell remained the fastest way to alert a population of fire, flood, or attack. Rural regulation. In remote areas without access to household clocks, the tower still provided daily rhythm. Public identity. The tower was often the tallest structure in town, visible for miles. It anchored the local skyline and gave architectural pride to even the smallest settlement. But functionally, its timekeeping duties were in sharp decline. Romanticism and ruin. With the 19th century came Romanticism, a cultural movement that celebrated the ruins of the past, especially in contrast to industrial modernity. Abandoned clock towers, their gears rusted and bells silent, became poetic images in paintings and novels. Travelers and poets spoke of towers as keepers of forgotten time, or the lungs of the old world, long since gone breathless. In some towns, citizens fought to preserve the tower, not because they needed it, but because they feared what its loss would symbolize. The end of shared time, the rise of isolated hours, the loss of something quietly sacred. And in certain regions, these campaigns were successful. The tower was restored, its chime rebuilt not as necessity, but as memory. Lessons from the bell. Looking back, it's clear the timekeeping tower was more than just an engineering marvel. It was a community metronome, guiding both sacred and secular life. A tool of governance, quietly reinforcing social order. A symbol of shared experience, where rich and poor alike heard the same toll and moved in its rhythm. And though the world has marched on, we remain surrounded by echoes of that era. School bells marking class periods, church bells calling to service, sirens testing at noon each month, phone alarms mimicking chimes. These are the descendants of the tower bell, quieter, subtler, but still trying to bring rhythm to human life. A moment of stillness. Let us imagine for a moment a forgotten village somewhere in Central Europe. The tower still stands slightly leaning, covered in ivy. Its clock face is faded, its hand stuck at 6:42. The bell, cracked, hasn't rung in decades. Children pass it on their way to school. Old farmers nod to it with memory. Tourists snap photos, then move on. But once, long ago, that tower was the center of everything. And if you closed your eyes, you might hear what the villagers once heard. A deep, measured toll, slow, certain kind. A sound that told them not just what time it was, but that they were together in it. Final reflection. In a time before apps, before atomic clocks, before digital alerts, there stood stone towers with bells. Their purpose was simple: to remind us when, and to remind us we were not alone in the knowing. The clock tower never hurried, it did not demand, it simply spoke and trusted that we would listen. Maybe that's what we've lost, not time itself, but the shared attention to it. And maybe one day we'll build something like it again.